What if Naruto was neglected and rejects the path of a shinobi and becomes something more powerful than that? Let's find out. But before we start, I want you guys to please like, share and sub. This really helps. Everything Satsuki was, she owed to Konoha. On its western side was a moss-mottled collection of boulders that adjoined a rill. These were the stone bosom that she would at times recline on, recollecting nascent memories, the fresh water gushing nearby pap to partake in when fatigued. On its eastern side was the forest. It was a rampart that reached the sun. The burnished boughs, extending every way as far as the eye beheld, were arms that occluded against an assault from the skies. Yet these arms, well versed in the ways of love, offered upwitted embraces, from time to time even divested themselves. Dripped from each fingertip a nectarine sap, shook out during intermittent gusts, as though ridding themselves of rainwater, fruits and flowers. During monsoon, the soil here fanned out on odoriferous wings and earthen scent. Even the matin song of birds then carried a note of veneration. To the north was the congregation of life. Clan compounds and watchtowers, the academy and the Kage office, the mountains with their solemn faces that some idiot every once in a blue moon defaced, orchards, arbors and halls, and all else that to her had been bequeathed by those before, and all that she in turn would bequeath to those that followed, even if her service ended in martyrdom. For therein lay glory. And to the south lay the congregated dead. Row on row of memorials and graves, belonging to those that to preserve their heritage, had forsaken themselves. Interred there, and there celebrated, were her clansmen too. So this place, this village, was not just her home, but a shrine. Here couched Supin unlimited grace. Her people had besprinkled it with blood and made it holy. For that she celebrated it with a suppliant knee for that, and for the freedom they upheld. Konoha had been there for her when her clan district wept like a network of rent veins. It had been there when she had shattered, when in one night the brother she loved had unmade her. Theirs was the hand that was extended in love, theirs the mercy, of which she considered herself unworthy. They had grasped at her sinking self, rescued it from its fragility and its self-fashioned abyss. She had been remolded. Rid of the voices in her that suggested dissolution. Fashioned into an instrument for service, a reed to be piped on, from which was drawn a devotional ditty, unparalleled in harmony and mellifluity. This she did for them unasked. This and more. Her oath to them was all she had, her lips fashioned for them and theirs, as from a lyre, a litany of hosannas. For what had been hers was under the dust, yet they had given her a world and more, given to her all she had and was. Yes, she thought to herself, serene, nodding while on her way to the Kage office. This and more was her due to the village, this and all they asked for, the sand. Her thoughts were abruptly ruptured by the water balloon that flew into her face. Let it here be noted that Satsuki Uchiha had earned her jonin rank. Let it also be noted that she had grinded away for 7 years in its pursuit. First for 3 at the academy, then for 2 with the Anbu, then as a liaison for a year with the root. That she had undertaken all the while missions demanding discretion, skill, valor and sacrifice. That she had on more than one occasion found herself a hair's breadth away from discovery, or worse, death. That she had surmounted all by being unsurpassed in intellectual and tactical genius. Let it be said that the sitting room in her Spartan residence shone with a luster resembling the star of the morning, for metal on metal was therein housed. Let all this and more be said in her praise. That she could take a blow, had taken a fist to the gut from Mito Guy during the Jonin exams, had once carried back Hatake Kakashi while herself perilously near death, one arm unfunctional and one side of her face a red ruin, was in fact in some quarters of the torture cell considered a demigoddess for her ability to take pain. But she was feared and adored in equal measure, and vaunted. Above all else, vaunted. None of this prepared her for the sheer indignity of standing in shock in the midst of a crowded street, mouth open, her face a multicolored mess, her once pristine jonin vest dripping the 7 shades of a rainbow. A blur of orange blinked in the distance and disappeared from view. The strangled growl that left her throat was guttural, startling only in its lack of dignity and femininity. People were staring. People were starting to talk. All were looking at her. All movement had ceased. All thought in her mind ceased too, bar those involving murder. Then, quicker than the flutter of an eyelash or a micro-movement in the flap of wings, she exploded into motion. The blur had been a mile away. It took her a second to bridge the distance. She knocked him out the air, dropped him into a set of trash cans in an alley, lifted him off the ground, ground him against a wall, held him there till he startled to purple, tears like pinpricks dotting the edges of his eyes. The absolute but reason by then made its return, and with that the first inklings of shame. She let him go. He crumpled and started to wheeze. Or so she thought. It started out in a set of wet hacking coughs and turned into the first rumblings of laughter. This rose in pitch till he was staring at her and laughing into her face though still in tears. And then she realized the tears were from laughter too. This motherfucker. You, she hissed through grit teeth, feeling once more the irrational desire to hurt him. The effect was ruined by some paint going into her mouth. She retched and rubbed vigorously. She spat out again. I am due at the Hokage's office in 6 minutes and you have ruined my uniform. And your face, he wheezed, lapsing into laughter. Hey up. Wah. Hey. Up. She stared at him thunderously. I had this made a week ago. The fabric is the best Konoha has to offer. It is freshly pressed, dry cleaned, and of both sentimental and ornamental value. And now it has paint all over it. Pay up. Boy, I ain't got any money, he said, frantic all of a sudden. You gonna shake down an academy student? That's cruel, even for you Shinobi. Don't be an extortionist, sister. She hauled him up and linked her arm to his, to avoid even the possibility of escape. Then you are coming with me to the Hokage, she announced, a note of finality in her voice. And with that, she started marching towards the office, him in tow. A quickly cast henge took care of the paint, at least for the moment. He sobered a bit as they walked and said, as though it mattered at all, lady, I'm sorry. Beg as much as you want. It will not get you out of this. Yeah. He nodded earnestly. Yeah, I know. It isn't that. I really am sorry, you know. Wasn't personal or something. You were the distraction. Stopped them right in their tracks, that. Them? I was being chazzed. He rubbed his head and looked away. That rung alarm bells. Chazzed. A Konoha Academy student. In Konoha. Impossible. He was from Konoha, wasn't he? She peered at him. Chazzed. In the flatness of that single syllable she conveyed her lack of faith in the notion. Why? He fidgeted around a bit, I might have kinda sorta decorated the Hokage monument. She looked up instinctively, and there it was. There in the distance. The Hokage monument, multicolored today, as it was once a year around this precise date and precise time. Oh my god, she whispered, deathly pale. Oh. My. God. Not again. Not this again. She closed her eyes, as though experiencing physical pain. And then to him, you are Naruto Uzumaki. And her prisoner puffed out his chest, perking up, preening at his celebrity. The one and only, he said with a grin. At your service. When Uzumaki Naruto was 4, the Hokage had held his hand and led him atop the Kage monument, there to sit, from there to view the village. The Hokage had talked about the need for each shinobi to preserve the sea of humanity, that down below drowsily steeped the village walks, peopled the plains, but all Naruto could see were ugly tracks of stone and straw that sprouted from the soil like a smattering of scabs and were cluttered close to each other, a congregation of dung heaps and ant hills. The people were pinpricks in the background, here and there picketing the earth for a rich load, or else in weary circumambulations, winding their way to weaponries or clan quarters. Their huffs and gesticulations resembled those of the half-crazed devotees he had once espied slitting the neck of a bull. Someday, the Hokage was saying, someday, Naruto, this province and its people will be yours to care for. Then you must forgive this old man his many frailties and foibles. If on that day you choose to relieve him of his duties and keep for yourself this hat, then so be it. I only wish to see you grow. I only wish that you love and be loved by our people. For that, you must hold this soil sacred. For that, you must vow to protect. Till that day arrives, however, you must take care that you uphold the will of fire, which is our greatest strength. The will of fire, Jiji? He'd asked, scrunching up his face. Yes. The Hokage smiled. The will of fire. It is a belief fashioned out of selflessness. It is the cumulative of our desire for peace, the sum total of our love for one another, beating as one heart, combined in one soul. The tree is one great body, and we are all as the leaves that clothe it, embrowned if fallen, thus autumned, but golden when on the bough. We purify the air the world breathes, we are the shade underneath which it reclines. Understand this, and you understand our village. And know that you too must sacrifice, and be willing. But the rest was lost in the clouded lanes of infancy, an insect traipsing across a rock had caught his attention. He presumed, however, that it too had something to do with love. Love, he had read somewhere, linked the past with the present and the present with eternity, was the twine that tied the heartstrings of man to man, was the portcullis that if crossed, ensured imminent arrival to the treasure trove sequestered within the mortal keep, there brimming, like a gourd of nectar about to overflow, all earth's blisses and joys. And he had never known love. He knew that people thought him to be an idiot. It was said at times that he was absent-minded or lacked application. But he noticed things. He had noticed, for example, even at 3, the downturn in mouths when he meandered about, had noticed the spite in the eyes of the matron at the orphanage. She never said a word. Not to him. 3 meals a day they gave him, but never what he wanted. Never a hug. Never a word of encouragement. Never their love. That they withheld. That, and recognition. That, and respect. That, and everything but the barest of courtesies. Even an accusation would have been preferred to their apathy. If he closed his eyes, it was like being dropped into the stream of time, from there to be borne back on powerful eddies to that day at the Kage monument. The Hokage was frozen, his mouth still open, flecks of spit like globular fireflies hanging suspended, pierced by motes of the fading sun. And oftentimes in dreams, on many nights prior to his discovery of the truth, Naruto would interrupt him halfway through his monologue and dully ask. You say love Gigi. You say they love everyone. So why won't they love me? Of course, he knew now. Had known for 5 years. Watching the Jonin who had been marching him to the Kage office freeze due to that little detail was hilarious, though. These fucking shinobi, man. So predictable. All the same. Automatons hauled off the same assembly line. Their ludicrous posturing. Their delusions of grandeur. Their crappy, sappy speeches about the village and the world as one great family. Their unerring devotion to an ideal which demanded of them that they all die. And lastly, their fear. Always the stench of fear clinging like cheap perfume to these self-sacrificial, hyperventilating, hypochondrial, sanctimonious set of hypocrites. Fear and loathing. Of him and the things sealed in him. They were fun to fuck with, though. He puffed out his chest and offered this one a wry grin. At your service, he said. And then something very odd happened. Instead of paling further, as those unlucky enough to discover themselves in the vicinity of the Kyuubi, no kitsune usually did, that included his pursuers, who at the best of times were reluctant and cowed, this girl, who couldn't be older than him by more than a year, if that, began to purple. You, she spat, and there was an underlying venom in her words, so you are the whelp who desecrates the monument every year. Have you no decency? No regard for your elders? None for what 4 generations of warriors have accomplished? You dare spit in the faces of those whose labors yield you a place to call your own? They built out of this barren land, which was once only hills and crags and silt and soot and rubble, a palace of pleasure for the likes of you. The air you breathe, the food you eat, the freedom you experience, it is your debt to them. And you. This is how you repay it, you ungrateful, spiteful, history-raising, monument-defacing little rodent. Here she lapsed into deep breaths, her cheeks flushed. A sudden wave of relief and mirth washed over him. There was something very liberating about her utter disregard for what he was. Her dislike was for Uzumaki Naruto, the person, and his deeds. It was not for Naruto, Jinchuriki, indentured from birth into a service for nation that he had never asked for, devoid of choice, spited for the crime of existing, expected to be a sacrifice on the front lines if war ever rolled around. And for that one moment, and that moment alone, Naruto would admit to himself that though she was flushed and multicolored, though heaving, and though probably lacking in the stability and sanity department, she was very pretty indeed. Yo, did they make you clean it, or something? He asked. Bryce, she said, through clenched teeth. Every fucking year. Oh. A pause. He closed his eyes, as though contemplating the secrets of existence. Then he opened them and shrugged. Can't say you didn't deserve it. He felt his lip curve into a grin as she exploded again. What a beautiful, beautiful day. The Hokage looked like a man inch by inch, evaporating with every puff of smoke he took. He seemed to diminish with every exhalation. A man entombed in himself, yet unable to escape. He was missing a few teeth, those which remained bore the same hue as egg yolk. His face bore a livery of spots, kingly crown of age. On him, these looked like the ripples on, and the ruptures around a scabby terrain eroding under an earthquake. His hairline had recessed, his skin sagged and was unhealthy, his eyes had well-worn grooves underneath. His calloused hands wore a visible web of veins. These ran up his arms, wreathed them like vine overgrown, were the ghoulish tracery that ornamented this living monument to decline and decrepitude. Only his eyes still had in the members of intelligence and a near undiminished sparkle, as of sunlight at late afternoon, reflecting off steel. He smiled at them when they walked in, his face for a moment enacting the slackening that age had enforced on his person. If it isn't Satsuki-chan. The facial decorations are a novelty. I must confess that I approve. His eyes gleamed. And you've brought with you just the person I wanted to talk to you about. Why, Naruto-kun, it's been a while since we last met. Have you perchance forgotten the way to these parts? I've said this before, but my doors are always open. Keep 'em shut, old man, the impudent boy next to her intoned. My days go better when I don't gotta see your ugly mug. For the 3rd time that day, her jaw dropped. This was compounded when the Hokage laughed. Still as blunt as ever, I see, he said. He turned back to her. I did not know that the two of you were well acquainted. We're no such thing, the boy squawked. Perish the thought, she muttered. Watercolor here, interrupted one. Oh, my pranks with her face. He desecrated the monument, Satsuki said angrily. And your face. Shut up, loser. Right back at ya, nutty bitch. The Hokage cleared his throat. Since we're all getting along so splendidly, he said, distinctly amused, I think it is time to get to the matter at hand. His face grew grave. His eyes lost their twinkle. He steepled his fingers together, leaned back, and looked at Naruto. I am graduating you, the Hokage said. The boy's face colored. Not with the hue or the languid splendor that framed the redolent remains of a dying day, but with the angry alacrity of a tomato mashed. Like hell you are, he howled. The Hokage put away his pipe and let out a weary sigh. You're 14, he said. You have been at the academy 8 years. You have failed to graduate on 3 different occasions. Today was the 4th. And I have had enough. I've been very patient with you. I have waited and let you do as you wished. I was sympathetic to your circumstances. I hoped that the occasional nudge and nicety would suffice. I said nothing the first time, despite suspecting. I said nothing the second, despite knowing. I said nothing the third, despite ironclad certainty and significant pressure from elsewhere. I'd hoped you would mature and see the light on your own. Now no more, however. I know that you failed on purpose every single time. I have seen 6 decades of Shinobi, but consistent self-sabotage to stay in the academy is a first. The Hokage rubbed his head and reached out for the glass of water on his table. He took a sip, stared at the boy's contorted expression for a second, stone-faced, then fished out a headband. He placed it on the table, then continued. You will stop this tomfoolery at once, mend your ways, and serve your nation as asked to. Appeals to merit, pride, or communal duty do not seem to work, so have this instead. This is an order. I am no longer begging. There will be no more pleas. Refuse this, and I will consider it tantamount to treason. He gestured to the headband. Choose, he said. It is either that or a lifetime in our highest security facility. The boy's jaw worked furiously. He hesitated a second, then grabbed the headband. Satsuki feared he'd crush it, such was the strength of his grip. He shoved it into his pocket instead. As you say, Hokage-sama, he said, voice clothed in formality, dripping with contempt. Am I to be given a team? The Hokage let out a second sigh, just as weary. His eyes alighted on her, and she knew what he was about to say before he did. She felt the blood drain from her face. No. Not this. Not this boy. Unfortunately, the Hokage said, we've been unable to find a suitable team to place you in. And therefore, we've decided to give you a sensei just for yourself. Her. He turned his profile so that Naruto was looking her way too. If that be your will, Hokage-sama, the boy said, drawing to attention, his voice a dull monotone, the fight knocked out of him. I'm just as an ant to a god, after all. If that is all, then may I leave? Naruto, the Hokage began tentatively. Yes, Hokage-sama. The Hokage sighed. Nothing, he said. You may leave. Hokage-sama, Satsuki began hesitantly, after the boy had marched out of the door, shutting it softly after him, instead of banging it shut, thus the more stinging in his censure. I do not know if this is a good idea. I am only 15, and the majority of my experience is with the Anbu. I have never taken a student before. You're my best shinobi, he said simply. He exhaled heavily and leant back, seeming to shrivel up as he did. And he is a flight risk. He swiveled his chair around and shuffled out of his seat. 3 steps brought him to an open window. He looked out, silent, perhaps taking in the monument, which was clearly visible from where he stood. Satsuki could picture it herself if she closed her eyes. Spartan, as befitting warriors, splendorous still, despite defacement, the 4 faces on it linking in service and sacrifice generations past and present. Those larger-than-life replicas were sacred, not for themselves, but due to the hands that had hewed them into that mountain. She could envision how that monument had come about. Blink twice, close your eyes, and there they were, the ghosts of workers who there gathered. Armed with pickaxes, eyes gleaming with singular intensity, they all strained sinew under a grandiosity of purpose, rippled stone with each stroke, as though it were a crystalline lake ruffled, supplicated themselves at the mountain's mouth, as to a deity, to fashion for posterity a stony memory of greatness, one that in times of despair would be an ensign, an eternal flag of hope. And if she kept her eyes closed long enough, then the workers' faces metamorphosed into those of her clansmen. She then saw the obduracy in their obsidian eyes. Their frames, shuddering shells of flesh and blood, with each stroke unselved, as she watched, skin unraveled, blood in vaporous trails, besprinkled the half-formed stone faces they hacked at. And, as the monument was upraised, her flesh of flesh, like morning dew, thawed, fused with those severe visages, therein were assimilated, until, fully formed, the monument mantled the skies, and bore the rosy hue of life, palpitating within stone the remains of her people, even in death, fructifying within their urn. The Hokage's voice arrested this flight of fancy. He was a delightful little boy, he said, his voice thick with grief. Bright and jovial. Full of warmth. The proud possessor of a quenchless curiosity. He sighed heavily and turned away from the window, a man until now burdened, but in the privacy of this office, allowing himself an instant of vulnerability, unburdening himself like a film reel unspooling of a memory long withheld. That is rare, you know, he went on dully. Curiosity. Most children that enroll at the academy show signs of unerring faith, even at a young age. talk to them, and ever present in the canvas of their mind are those first brushstrokes of obedience. It is that which we help fill in. That fixity of will, to subsume the self in a cause far greater than itself, sleeps quiescent within them. It is that which we awaken. But it is present. Most men and women are directionless, lost. It is in service they find themselves in that, and in being an atom of an emperor that will outlive them, outstrip eternity. A shinobi sups on cynicism, is the epitome of pragmatism, but when it comes to this ideal alone, we are all romantics, idealists, dreamers, madmen. He was the opposite. He was warm, but the locus of his warmth was the world, not the ideal. His was a wellspring of passion overrun. I still remember that little boy who loved freely, who clutched at my fingers and called me Gigi, who wished to bring to the world only peace and joy. The Hokage sank back into his chair and held his head in his hands. He remained that way a while. "All that I ask of you," he said eventually, "is that you give him a chance. Do not judge him, as others have in the past. He may be hostile, difficult to deal with, but forgive him his follies. In doing so, it is not just him you forgive, but me. I have made him what he is. My inability to nourish his tenderness of sensibility has poisoned it. And now my desperation must further fan his hatred. He is right, of course. He was never of our mold, never meant to be a shinobi. He lacks the ruthlessness necessary. But he is our Jinchuriki. His free will is what I owe his father, but my debt and duty to the village are even greater, and it is that which I must uphold. His free will is what circumstance forces me to temper. I can, however, offer him a benignant jailer. The best I have." And here he looked at her, as a man drowning would at a life raft. "Hokage-sama." She was moved by the trust she was being offered, yet still uncomfortable. "If this is your will, then it will be done. But I fear that this is ill-advised. I've never known tact. I'm not very patient. There are others more capable, more willing to make concessions for his special circumstances. Tenzo-senpai is well equipped to subdue a Jinchuriki, if need be. Asuma-senpai has more experience. And even Anko-sensei. What he needs more than a mentor," said the Hokage, "is a confidant. A friend. You're nearly the same age. There will be commonalities. Or if not, then they will emerge over time." He picked up his pipe and stuck it back into his mouth, then stooped and rummaged about, fetched for her a bunch of dossiers, which he handed over. He'd done away with all semblance of vulnerability and was back to being her leader. "Those are his files. Consider his service to be a matter of national importance." "I understand, Hokage-sama. I am asking you to do what I was unable to." The Hokage looked at her somberly. "Win his trust. See to his growth. Ensure his allegiance to the leaf, by whatever means necessary." "Yes, Hokage-sama." She bowed. And Satsuki, his voice was as the breath of winter, "If he attempts to desert, if that remote possibility were to become a reality, and you find yourself unable to thwart it, then I once more ask that you do something I was unable to an erstwhile student of mine. I want you to take his life." Strokes of lightning, like celestial blades unsheathed, ripped asunder the bosom of the sky, shafts of dying sun, fast devoured by a canopy of cloud, tinctured red the rain that fell. Gusts and buffeting torrents here and there enacted their violence. Bruised boughs, lashed at lamp posts, cleaved through the intricate circuitry of wires, rendering tracks of the village dark, turned the world beneath into a dust bowl, stirred, as with a ladle, all not infixed into the ground signboards, cardboard cartons, clothing lines, sheaves of grain, were all set awhirl. Stirred, swirled, dashed to dust. The wind tonight was the wrenching gasp of a man on the precipice, the clap of thunder that accompanied it, the final groan, conversion to carrion. Naruto reclined against the Hokage monument through it all, a stalk of straw in his mouth, and watched it unfold, stared at the sky, unseeing, then down below, in disdain. The salt copper taste of the first drops of rain still clung to his lips. Raindrops. Lingering fingers that stroked softly. They jogged his fantasy. He imagined in them the touch he never knew. That of his mother. Uzumaki Kushina. Their patter was a lullaby crooned, one that in its maternal hum, allowed him to pretend for a second that all was okay. Though the heavens had now opened and drizzle turned into deluge, the honeyed sweetness of those first notes still echoed in the mind and its mazy caverns. Those fingers that had stroked skin and hair still strummed at the heart with lyre-like efficacy. And it was all imagined. Just imagined. He closed his eyes, drenched but unbothered. Tried recapturing that initial sensation. But all he met were thoughts of discontent, a flood unchecked that washed away all else. Already the sensation was gone, already the memory was dissolving too, and from its wreckage there eddied outwards a resentment that took even him by surprise. "You must be proud, huh?" he said softly. His voice was lost in the wind, which down below enacted an erasure on all that was too weak to withstand it. "Isn't this what you wanted for me?" he called out again. Only the roiling clouds rumbled in reply. "Mapped out my entire life, I'm sure," he went on. After all, you were exceptional. Fearless, I've heard. And selfless. He stood. The scent of slush flooded his nose. It wasn't altogether unpleasant. He wiped his wet palms on his tracksuit, which by now was a muddy mess, then laughed bitterly. Yeah, that's it. Selfless as fuck. And infatuated with this shithole. You died for these people. That's what you'd want me to do too, huh? Die for M. They don't give a shit about me, but you'd want me to die for M anyway. 5 steps brought him to a puddle. He knelt. Stared. The face that looked back at him was weary and whiskered, yet leonine in a way, the golden locks a snapshot of a star exploding. So similar in some ways, yet so dissimilar, for surely that man would have never learned resentment, never questioned any of this organized farce of killing and dying. The thought of entrapment would never even have occurred to him. For there were people who reveled in being different, in being the bastion on which all hope was pinned. All meaning and purpose in their lives was distilled down to bearing on their shoulders the world and its various burdens. The entirety of their identity hinged on masquerading as a messiah. Peril came to them unsought, and they mastered it, for they were different, exceptional, special. They did not care about dying young, or only being a face on a monument. They did not care that they left behind no memory, or a broken family. Service to them was in the glory of death, and not in the drudgery of life. Being a bulwark against the world and its ills to the fragility they fathered was irrelevant, meant nothing. Selfish enough to have kids, but selfless in all else. You'd ask me to die, as you did, because you were exceptional. You loved them. You loved them more than you ever loved me. You turned your own son into a monster. And as he looked, as raindrops ruffled the puddle, the face seemed to morph, to age, to gain more definition and lose its whiskers. It now wore a sunstruck smile, one that never in reality would alight on Naruto, for the man had not only destroyed himself, but every last vestige of what he, Naruto, could have had to save these people who did not deserve it. All I ever wanted, Naruto whispered, tears and rain now mingling, was to be ordinary. You, me, Mum. Just the 3 of us in some small civilian village, away from all this. No death, no shinobi, no expectations, no Hokage, none of what you made me. Just the 3 of us, in some small shanty. And we'd be happy. I'd be happy. He rose and began walking away, the wind still screaming in his ears. I hate you, Dad, he said softly, knowing that Namikaze Minato's stone bust still loomed large behind him, wishing he could more than just color it. Deface it, perhaps. Or raise it. I hate you more than I hate anything else in this world. For what you've turned me into, and the dream you've taken away. We got off on the wrong foot yesterday, Satsuki said. She'd found Uzumaki and informed him of their meeting spot last evening, before the storm. They were in training ground 4. There was a lake at the center. Broken boughs littered the wet grass, snaked across the lake, left in their wake a trail of leaves and splinters. Twigs, like shattered antlers, perforated the earth, needled water. Moss-mottled boulders like crooked elbows here and there jutted. The storm had dug some up, leaving in their place a sprinkling of cavities, shallow graves newly created. These, at each gust, exhaled dust, emitted an earthen ooze. Late spring, revivified by the storm, spread around them its verdurous braid, wreathed the world in green gloss, fern and moss, a floral sea. You don't say. So allow me to rectify it, she said. I'm Uchiha Satsuki. I made Chunin at 9, Jonin at 11, and have worked with the Anbu for 2 years. I'm a ninjutsu and kenjutsu expert. We'll see which of my specialties suits you best. It may not be easy, but I have faith in my ability to tailor a program to your strengths. I'm the best shinobi this village has recently produced. I boast a 100% mission completion record. This may sound immodest, but as a matter of fact there is no better instructor you could be allotted. I've seen it all, done it all, worked with everyone in Leafworth Arаю, and successfully lived through 8 S-rank missions. I'll be coaching you for the foreseeable future, and I expect excellence. Her student regarded her with a studious look. Maybe he wouldn't be that difficult, after all. Maybe she could even befriend the boy eventually, as the Hokage Desi. Yeah, whatever. You always this fool o' yourself. Her eye twitched. The hell with the Hokage. Listen here, you, she caught herself in time and put on a sickly sweet smirk, you delightful little boy. I'm your sensei. I'm here to hand-hold you, since the Hokage apparently thinks you cannot even urinate without assistance. That's fine by me. What isn't, however, is your tone. You will address me with deference. And I expect unquestioning obedience. If I say run, you run. If I say jump, you ask, how high? And if I say play dead, you play dead, tongue lolling out, like the tantrum-throwing little runt you are. Is that clear? There was prolonged silence. I think, Uzumaki announced, his face grave but his eyes shining, I'm gonna like you. And that's when she knew her day was only going to get worse. She cleared her throat. Back to more important. You're right, you know, he burst out, his face alight with sudden mischief. We kinda did get off on the wrong foot. So let's spend the day getting to know each other. We are going to train. Oh, come on, sensei. He added a sing-song lilt to the last word. There's days and days ahead to train. You can tell me tomorrow just how much I suck and how I'll never be a good shinobi. Let's not do that today, eh? She hesitated. The day was indeed nothing in the larger scheme of things. And she could see the possibilities. He'd made a voluntary offer to furnish her with information. He might not make another if I shoot this down. But was his offer of conditional trust just an excuse to loaf about? Highly likely, and was it worth the authority sacrificed? She sighed. Fine, she said. Just for today, though. Fantastic. His smile was all teeth and she didn't like the look of it. My treat. I know just the place. In all honesty, she'd expected far worse than a ramen shop. The setting was Spartan but spick and span, and the food was decent. The service was not all that bad either. Another bowl, old man. She eyed the bowl heap in Uzumaki's vicinity warily. She'd never seen one man eat so much. I'm grateful for this, you know, he said to her between slurps. Didn't think you'd agree. The Hokage thinks you are a flight risk. It was a calculated gamble. She'd hoped to incite a reaction. Him knowing or not knowing was irrelevant, for he had no hope of outwitting or outrunning her anyway. Whether it inspired an escape attempt out of sheer desperation or thwarted it for fear, she did not care. She was disappointed. Bar a slight stiffening of his shoulders and a slight lull in the slurping, there was no other response. As he, now, Uzumaki said, offering her a beatific smile. That's why he sixed you on me? Maybe. This mission over, then. I'm not a flight risk. Tell him that and we can all go home, kick up our legs, and share a nice little cigar. You expect me to believe that? He waved his chopsticks about and shook his head. Nah, not that. Or me. He shrugged. Just the circumstances. Meaning? I wanna run, he said, between slurps, as though he were discussing the weather and not confessing to treason. I've wanted to run since I was 8. Got to the gate once, then turned back. He tapped his head. It's common sense, you see. They won't let me go. I got this bastard fox in my gut. He grinned fierily at her sudden discomfort. They'll chase me through the shinobi nations for it. There's nowhere I can hide. They'll find me. And they'll make me serve. If not you and your lot, then someone else will. The world is crawling with your kind, after all. Then. Yeah. I'd rather be here than strapped to an extraction table in Kumo or Iowa. Here at least there's familiarity. And the old man did love me once. Besides, I'm dead. There, I'm just a dead man walking. What does it matter? Something about that did not sit right with her. It is my job to see to your survival. And Naruto, you are one of us. This was greeted with laughter. My dear girl. The creases around his eyes were drawn out in mirth. I'll never be one of you. There was a short pause. So that's it, then? She asked, taking a dainty bite from the bowl before her. You spend your days moping around and bemoaning fate. Feeling sorry for yourself. For the first time there was an edge to his voice. Yeah, he said. So what if I do? If I don't feel sorry for myself, then who will? You. My dear dead father. You're all cut from the same cloth, man. What's wrong with not wanting to be like you? Is wanting to be left alone now a crime? Not everyone has to be a shinobi, you know. Not everyone's gotta like it either. But there is glory in service. And that is something a lot of us aspire to. Yes. A lot of you. But not me. Never wanted it. And no one asked me if I did. No sir. He made a swishing motion with his hand. Just thrust it on me, like so. And I can't even fucking run. Oi, old man, one more. She hummed. Suckled at a few strands. Admired the texture and the aroma. This really was good. Then what do you want? What is it that you dream about? I dream? I dunno. Start a shop next to this, maybe. Live off it. Just live, really. Drift about. Stay unknown. Die unknown. Be buried with the commons. If there's any talk of burying me with shinobi, I'd rather just be burned. Scatter the ashes in the old man's office. That, she said, pointing at him with a chopstick, that's the loser in you talking, with all the accompanying cowardice. You shinobi, man. Loser this, coward that. He cleaned out his bowl and put it down. The count was at 11. Self-aware losers get to see another day. Cowards have lived longer, happier lives than all your Kage combined. What's screaming like a nutter when I see the enemy, or being stoic in the face of overwhelming odds, gonna get me? Martyrdom. A memorial. Thanks, but I'm good. You can keep em both. Earn em, rather, with your bravery. There's no cure for that, or for stupidity. He stood. Gotta use the loo, he said. We'll be right back. He disappeared from sight and she was left to her thoughts. What an enlightening conversation. He was craven, his attitude was shit, he sounded like a bleeding pacifist, and he was more likely to die to an insect than kill a man. She had a job and a half on her hands. Thus she remained, lost in her thoughts, wondering how the boy had ended up being what he was, and despite herself feeling a grudging admiration towards how he stood up to her. Not many did that. Not these days. She looked up from her empty bowl. It had been 10 minutes. He was still nowhere in sight. Only the shop owner dithered about, looking sympathetic and compassionate. The first stirrings of unease took hold. Where is he? The owner avoided her eyes. He told me to leave you the bill. The man slipped a small white sheet to her. And on it was an obscene amount. And also this. Another white sheet. This had words on it. Payback is a bitch, innit, sensei. Was all it said. And somewhere within her, she felt a scream building. She'd rip his head off. She'd rip his fucking head clean off. That night, she dreamt. She was unsure what inspired this particular dream. It had been a while since she had dreamt it, an event unremarkable now and best left unremembered, but one that on its occasion had produced a profusion of grief, left her a husk. She did not dream a lot. More often than not, after a strenuous mission, there were pills taken to avoid the possibility. For the shinobi who dreamed, she had heard, dreamt not of dandelion fields, or fleets victorious, or gutsy escapades unending. It was not the area either they winged, triumphant, but the vast abyss, which redounded with the hollow laughter of gusts numerous. As of reeds dissonant, and offered only a malevolent mist. Spouts of exploding magma in a shower of sludge wreathed and weathered the air. The very dreamscape itself, realm of clefts and crags and darkness illimited, on those occasions seemed to melt, was miasmatic, cast up shadows, breathed here and there in vaporous trails, the outline of enemies fallen, reincarnating them, rendering them larger than life, till the weary wayfarer, with oar lost and sail rent, found himself night on night racked by a phosphorus flame that daybreak fanned into the first sparks of madness. Dreams, therefore, were to be avoided. But more important was to identify a dream for what it was and that she could do. And so it was with a familiar distress that she identified the shut door, the shapes in the background that said nothing but watched with intent, the row of lamps indented into the wall, which with reticent glimmers, turned the room into a kaleidoscope of shadows. And at the center was the bandaged man, proctor for the day, awaiting to allow this dance of death. She closed her eyes, wished the plane would crack, wished to return to reality, knew it was never that easy. She should have expected it, really. How could it be any other way, after what the Hokage said yesterday about befriending the Jinchuriki and doing away with him if need be? The man knew what test she'd undergone, after all. There he was. Standing across. Her best friend. The only one she'd allowed herself and the only friend she'd ever have. The boy that she had come to see as an extension of herself. Blade raised. His face without expression. Barely 9, if that. Her Sharingan could see every tremor in his hand. His fear. His desperate desire not to die. Still a child. The promise of the world before him, but the world outside shut now, and soon to be shut forever. All that awaited him, she knew, was the embrace of earth. A bud broken, left to decompose. For he never had been a match for her, the event designed from the beginning to be a slaughter. The test of her mettle. Of her loyalty. Of her desire to kill for country, even if it be this boy, who for a year had been her crutch. Who had drawn her out of her shell. Who'd brought her laughter and joy. Her brother in arms. His lips were resolute, but his eyes begged for life. It is done already, she said to herself, but thoughts from that day were seeping in. Her reluctance to kill, her desire to die instead. How the blood had left her face when she found out what she was to do, how her strength cindered. How a year of conditioning in that moment had failed. How she'd wept and shaken her head. How tried to run. Leave the facility. How in that moment she hated them as she now loved them. Then, the day before the fight, he'd approached her, embraced her, asked her do her best. To live. Not just for herself, but for her clan. For the village. For him. To carry within her his memory. She, his urn, in her constituted all the qualities he once possessed. His art. His laughter. His love for life. And then he'd spoken of his love for the village, which had saved him, clothed him, given him food, made out of him the pinions that would help her soar, for he was a clanless no-name, and she, destined for greatness. And in her tale would be interwoven his. He, more than a footnote, her friend, the boy she slew as a testament to national love. Better to die at her hand, he said, than at the enemy's. It was unraveling now, half memory half dream. Her hesitance despite the signal. On his part, none. The ferocity of his strokes. Fanaticism, as of a hunted animal, gleamed in his eyes. He derived strength from despair and despite his words, was so unwilling to die. The desperation. The pressure. He skittered across the turf and his sword sang with an artistry worthy the pictures he drew. He smote and smote and smote again, and she parried, redirected, tried placing between them a safe distance, tried gathering herself, shut out every memory of their time together, sunlit excursions, crumbs of confidences shared, awkward training sessions, as though puppeteered. The innocent embraces of children who in each other replaced all they lost, hushed conferences, hopes, fears and dreams whispered each to each in a dimly lit room. She shut out the future and its promises, which were the anadem that begirt life's lustrous locks, the architrave emblazoned into the doorways of days to come. She shut out the future, their future that she or he must now in one stroke hew. There were animals. Ink constructs. Arisen from the lapses she afforded him. Tigers sprang forth with emergent claws, attempting to sunder. When that failed, ravens. Crowding. Besieging. Attempting to misdirect or to buy time. She tore through their canopy. And then it was just the two of them, him tiring, flagging, starting to slow, and her, still the same. I can't do this. Time stopped. And then in her dream the ground split and limb by limb, as though spat from leaf's earth, there emerged her clansmen. Father. Mother. Playmates, tutors, uncles, the aged and the young, shinobi and civilian, all the life that Itachi had ended, flaking and cracking the earth, springing forth silently, emerging in human transparent wraiths that still bore beneath their blooded habiliments the gashes, which like a waterfall wept each other, blessed with it the land. In their ruined visages, as in paper lamps, were imprisoned the final flickers of a greatness which once moved heaven and earth, now diminished, yet still too great for ghastly vessels to hold. They embraced her. Scattered into mist even as they did. In the end, it was Nada that did it, but them. Their dissolving hands moved her arm. They spurted Chidori into life. It was they that stamped out her surroundings and imposed upon her breast a sedateness which dispersed all inconstancy. They were her armor, they, her sword. And it was at their behest she covered the 20 meters separating her and her best friend in a millisecond. Tore through his heart. Stood there, unmoved, as his eyes widened, his mouth bubbled red. A final plea was there formed and snuffed. Blood in a fine spray gilded all. Only, as she watched, the face, now forgotten, concretized. The hair wasn't dusk, but gold, and the eyes azure instead of coal black. The face, whiskered, stared at her in shock. Even in death, the lips were pulled into that feral grin. The realm of unreality ruptured, shattered like porcelain flung against a wall. She was awake again. Rays of sun like tears unfrozen streamed into her room through the slatted windows. Her body delivered its daily parcel of phantom aches and pains. She was a broken winged fly trapped in torment's mesh. She grit her teeth. The pain would fade. It always did. But there was something else on her mind, too. She winced, tucked her fingers under the collar of her nightdress, touched her shoulder, ran her thumb against the scar that he and death had made. Sai's last gift to her. The first scar of many. I'm sorry. I really am. She sighed. Got out of bed. Went straight to her bookshelf and fetched a sheet, a brush, and her palette of colors. Moved away. Pulled open the door. Dawn, draped in a mantle of red, greeted her. The night stars, nebulous pinpricks, still winked, as though in drowse. The streets in her clan compound were empty. But in the distance, a chirp of birds, the first pangs of conversation. Day sundering the husk of night, thus emerging with sunlit limbs and a crown of gold, thus reborn. Her lips curved into a smile. She took a seat on her porch and began to paint. There was a forest. At its lip was a loosely screwed metal flap swabbed in sand and rust, missing one of its two supports, thus spun like a Ferris wheel by each gust. Once a signboard. Now a miniature auxiliary windmill, on which were scribbled these words. Forest of Death. He'd last visited this place a while ago. A coiled serpent, wound whip of intricately patterned bronze, fell from a tree and lashed his shoulder. It threw up a clarion of hisses, reminding him why this was so. Mosquitoes the size of slingshot stones swarmed. Buzzed warnings. Wore on their translucent wings silver-white livery lendings of the moon. They were chapped sentries to the wilderness within. His frame, blooded born, was the fount they sought to sup on. He waved them away and hurried to the dusted arch that shook when touched and shed flakes of mud like soft spring rain. The disused doorway underneath was slate gray and resembled a drawbridge barred. He vaulted over the arch. At his landing, an assortment of yellowed eyes like searchlights gleamed, observed every motion yet kept their distance. There were rumbles emitted. These, kneading earth and air, resembled drum beats, were drawn out into the sense of thundering hooves. The warning that he knew to heed. All around him rose various willows, a phalanx upreared. Each tree billowed upwards, speared the sky with burnished boughs infinite, thus punctured, starlight and ghouls, gushed through a mesh of reddish brown. The forest strummed the notes of autumn and rippled with a rumor of war, while the world outside slept and celebrated spring. Outlines of monstrous nests here and there dotted the dark. These, he knew, harbored blue-black eggs the shape of cannon shells, and hatched and housed plumed predators, unending that once alerted, were as poisoned darts from a quiver inexhaustible. He moved forward, and spiderweb, resembling in texture and hue phlegm and spittle frozen, glistened. Chains for the unwary. They showered forth a runnel of sap that emitted a fragrant musk, but blackened and deadened all it touched. He stood for a minute in the midst of this armory to all nightmares. Croak suppurating like conches blown sent shivers down his spine. Yet he kept his eyes closed. Attempted to envision the path that he, when young, had followed, for the forest, he knew, ran labyrinthine and could be traversed for days without end. He'd explored it, after all. To its western side were fens and bogs, where skeletons long forgotten were outposted. These, strung with rotted flesh, bloomed through the mire. A shattered rib cage decomposing wood here often spread its calcified petals, the odor a warning against the carnivorous murk. To the east the temperature rose with every step taken. Trees tiptoed, first to sparseness, then oblivion. One eventually reached a desert that inspired in the mouth an aridity. Breath became a burden, emerged in drowsed exhalations, the body in sluggish motions, enacted a dehydration-induced shriveling. Sand gyres whirled, and so did the sky, and round the world went, till one sank into a light-headed renunciation of thought and feeling, and let the sun-scavenged sky evaporate the last drops of life beating one's coil. It was to the north that he intended to journey today. This direction, though fraught with peril too, was the mildest of the three. There was a loamy strip of land not far from where he stood. It wore a necklace of reddish rocks, and was neighbored by a stream where shimmied a school of fish, utterly harmless, utterly ordinary. Conical trees, crenellations manned by a watch of red leaves that the seasons rotated, kept the location privy. This place had been his secret spot for a year and a half, but that was a while ago. It was this that he now sought. And it was this that he found, though it took him an hour, and though by the time he found it his tracksuit bore the evidence of a scraper 3 with forces predatory. Namely, with a gigantic serpent and a mutated bird with 2 heads and 4 pairs of wings. He felt a spark of life in dismembering both, his heart distended with a joy that for the last 2 years had lain forgotten. Yet he was huffing too. This had once been easy. Fucking hell. He shut his eyes. Went through the motions of the academy stance. Then substitution. Transformation. The clone technique. Graduated to all else that he first with desire and then in despair had learnt. Tree climbing. Water walking. Bisecting a leaf with a mote of wind. All these were dredged up from the pits of memory and relived. His heart leapt with remembered rhythms long forsaken. They were still a part of him. It was all still a part of him. Naruto wreathed himself in wind chakra and pushed off, sped forth and split boulders, watched them disintegrate, spun their dust skyward with a flick, let the particles hover a while, then spat wind bullets at them, and laughed long and hard at the facade of freedom brought by these actions in this void. Here he could pretend that all this, all he did, meant nothing. It was not the thrum of power at his fingertips that he celebrated, nor the damage he caused, but the utter uselessness of it all. Here in this quiet cove of his there was no one watching, no one to chronicle or censure what he did, or to decide where he be placed or what armies lead, how best brought to heel, how sacrificed. There was one technique left. One still incomplete. The weightless freedom of this moment nudged an attempt. He grit his teeth. Shut his eyes. Extended an open palm. The seed of a vortex sprang forth, gyrated, gradually grew in size, first to that of a lemon, then to that of a jackfruit. All at once it exploded forth in a blue storm, winching and whirled out of existence, leaving behind only a mangled hand. He sank to his knees and tried quelling the tremors that shook his frame. Blood stippled the grass. Duke. Fuck. 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 But he was laughing. Laughing through tears and reveling in the torrent of curses that streamed forth. The clear rill that licked the periphery of this loamy land beckoned, and there he washed his hand. There freely wept, so that tears like raindrops rippled the rill. Each drop that hit the transparent surface marred his reflection, expanded outwards in concentric circles, a mirror fracturing. And the reflected network of trees behind shook free their reddened braids, their leaves strands of hair spilling loose, strands that with each swirl, feathered his image in a mother's embrace. He was late by a few minutes for training. It was dawn by the time he dragged himself home, then he overslept. So it was with some trepidation that he reached the training ground. She was wearing a violet hakama, and her hair was a bun maintained by a russet ribbon and 2 needles. Her sword was out, the scabbard at her side empty. He watched her twirl through a set of routines with a grace utterly inhuman and mesmeric. There was something feline, something artistic about the economy of movement, the sudden sharp changes in direction. She dropped her shoulder one way then exploded the other, and in the same motion pivoted and drew, as though making a brush stroke on a canvas. There was a dignified beauty in her face that the daintiness of motion accentuated. Suppressed joy, too. Each elaborate thrust threw into relief her suppleness of form. A rosy hue dappled her cheeks. Satisfaction shimmered in her eyes, which with each shimmy brightened. Uchiha Satsuki. He did not know what to make of her. In moments like this he felt the first stirrings of something he'd never felt before. Admiration. She was beautiful to watch. A mistress of her craft. And it felt nice to have someone to talk to, someone who did not care what he was or what his father had done for the village, someone who took no shit and was scathing when necessary. But kind too. She sat and listened yesterday when she did not have to. Argued with him, yes, but sat and let him talk. Then said to him she'd be there to see him through. He felt a queer joy when she said that, even though the rational part of him knew it was just her responsibility. The click of her sheathing her sword broke him away from his contemplation. "You're late." He rubbed the back of his head. "I kinda overslept. See that it does not happen again." Straight to business, then. No mention of yesterday. "Okage-sama told me that we are to start with D ranks," she said. "But before we do, I would like to assess your skill level." "Fine by me." He walked across and dropped into the academy stance. She, however, made no move. Just stood there and scrutinized him for a second, as though he were a puzzle that needed piecing together. It irked him. "Naruto," she said, as though come to a decision, "I need you to help me with something. I read your academy reports, and they are very odd." He raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Yes. Quite odd, indeed. You were top of the class for the first 3 years. No issues bar being a nuisance in the classroom. Tell me how someone like that goes from being a high flyer to dead last." "I told ya. Didn't want to be a shinobi." "Yes. But you excelled for the first 3 years anyway. What changed?" He gave her a wry smile. Then exploded into motion. To her credit, bar a slight widening of eyes, she did not react at all. Simply parried his strike. Then drifted backwards as he continued his surge. She did not bother defending, bobbed and weaved instead. "Your speed is impressive for a genin." She ducked under a haymaker, then circled out of his pressure without a care in the world. "Very impressive," she amended, as he further upped the tempo, now frenzied in motion, his movements containing very little grace, but compensating for it with the sheer power behind everything he threw. Yet nothing connected. She was as flowing water, liquid in her movements, as the air itself, slipping out of the tightest spots with weightless ease, not even bothering with a defense, or the pretense of one. What rankled a bit was that she looked almost bored. And then mid-movement, she switched. He was half a head taller than her. Probably had 20 kilograms on her. He pressed her with the certitude of superior strength, with the belief that if he were to land a solid strike, it'd be enough to bend her over, make her fold. None of these inbuilt advantages made any fucking difference. Her languid kick landed with a snap, sent him careening through grass. He dug up a smoking trench in his wake, cratered the soil, a comet fallen, streaked through the lake top, severed it in half for a second, left behind frothing eddies, and was brought to an abrupt halt by a stone face of solid rock, head hidden in the ground and limbs akimbo. A scarlet pain coruscated from his wrist and exploded outwards, rattled his ribsage, drove a serrated knife through his skull. He groaned through a mouthful of mud. In retrospect, she'd let him read her intentions, allowed him to see her maneuver from a mile away, so that he got his arms up in defense. If she hadn't done that, that kick would have probably broken him in half. He'd broken something anyway. There was someone next to him. Pulling him out. Turning him over. Tripping over words. Issuing forth apologies. He saw her for a second in blurred triplicate, her face twisted into a panicked blob. There was a finger swimming at the edges of his vision. It moved across his eyeline. It was a fine fucking finger, snow-white and dainty, and where was he, again? "Follow it," she was saying, her voice disembodied, an echo. He shut his eyes for a moment and ignored the pain, the bludgeoning, burgeoning pain, which was nowhere and everywhere and muffled him up in its scarlet, star-speckled mantle. He opened his eyes. Her fingers' motions across the eyeline were easier to follow. Was that necessary? His voice sounded hoarse, even to his ears. "I did not put much into that." She nibbled at her lip, a child chastised. "I've never had a student before. I forgot how fragile genin fresh out of the academy are. And I do not think you have a concussion, for what it is worth." "Joy," he whispered. "Always been durable." She took his hand and turned it over. Pain lanced through his wrist. He inhaled sharply. A balmy green coated her palm, this she applied to his wrist, and slowly, ever so slowly, the pain trickled away into nothingness. Broken bone readjusted itself. She held onto his hand longer than was necessary, staring at his calloused palm. Her eyes narrowed. He wondered, those scars. The apologetic note from before was scrubbed out, and there was now a note of authority in her words. "I know of only one technique that leaves them." Oh, crap. He weighed his options. But the bottom line was that she knew, and that any denial would only sever the tentative trust they'd built the day before. He decided to make a clean breast of it. "That's your answer," he said. "I beg your pardon. The one to your question from a while ago. How someone tops the academy 3 years, then drops off a cliff. When I was 6, I was naive. Wanted to win everyone over, wanted them to respect me, love me, perhaps. I spent days and days in the library and picked up little snippets. Studied scrolls. Created a base. Practiced all day long. Excellence became an obsession. My role model, of course, was the fourth Hokage. He let out a hollow laugh. Her face, it seemed to him, had decked itself in the trappings of sympathy. Who didn't love the man? He was so far above us all, a god in a way. He gave himself up so we could live, and I wanted that. I wanted to be just like that. I read everything I could about him, obsessed over him. Sought to recreate his techniques, for which I found hints in speculative papers. The academy was easy. Boring. This is where I spent the entirety of my time. He was my hero. My sensei in spirit. I wasn't Uzumaki Naruto, I was Namikaze Minato. That's the life I lived daily. He grinned. Then I found out the truth. And my love for the man turned into hate. I was no longer obsessed with saving the village, but with surpassing that man, so I could spit in his face. I'd never be him. I'd surmount him, be his better in every regard. Take his techniques to heights he never could, not for him or the village, but to show him how all his talent was worth no more than ash at the end. How his sacrifice meant nothing. How his son, whom he sentenced to a lifetime in penury, would store and hoard knowledge far beyond his wildest imaginings, but never use it in defense of what he loved. And that's how we reached the point I told you about yesterday. That's when I decided to run. I spent 2 years stitching together odds and ends, gathering power to the extent I could, and training like a maniac, like my life depended on it. Because to me, it did. I forsook the academy. It was worthless to me. Didn't even attend most of the time. What changed? She asked. I remember being frustrated over my lack of progress. I dunno if you remember, but we held the Chunin exam 3 years ago. I went and watched. And all I saw was killing and dying refined into art. I saw people who'd given up a decade and all the little things in life. But never noticed the song of birds or sat and watched the snow fall or discarded an umbrella and danced in heavy rain, who knew the price of life but not its value, who'd let military discipline govern all, censure all, who'd given up all they could be, only to lie there at the end like a broken stalk with a kunai in their throat, wondering what could have been, lamenting the life unlived. I saw life wasted. Life subjugated. Mindless drones who killed or were killed in bouts of madness. And I saw in all this a mirror held up to me. This is what I was becoming. In attempting to spite my father, I'd lost myself, become the very thing I hated. Even in death he held power over me, twisting and corrupting. He paused. Closed his eyes. Smiled in rapture. But he only held power over me till I let him. I saw the hopelessness in my trying to run. These shinobi at the exam, they weren't even the cream of the crop. But some of them were stronger than me. To surpass them would mean another year or 3. To surpass those who sent them. That was a lifetime's work. A lifetime not just unlived, but spent in bitterness. Wasted. And I didn't want to be that. I never fucking wanted that. Living the way I do, I might be dead by 16. But at least it's a life I live for myself and not in competition with a ghost. I make my own choices. I'm free. As figuratively free as I let myself be, though you and your kind may enslave me or condemn me to a quick grave. Because, as I said yesterday, I'll never be one of you. And that's enough for me. He opened his eyes and saw the girl lost for words. Thought he saw traces of pity in her eyes. He grinned. And now, as a thank you for patching me up and listening to all that, how about a cup of ramen? My treat. He laughed. For real this time. They were seated at Ichiraku's ramen. They'd done their first D rank. Never had Satsuki seen someone so eager to clean drains or so eager to never ever graduate from that task. After their conversation yesterday, however, she understood his reasons better. Her heart wasn't made of stone. She sympathized over his lack of choice, sympathized, indeed, with what had been done to him and what he was. But then again, when half asleep last night, a thought had suggested itself to her. Sai did not have much choice either. And, as a matter of fact, neither did she. Yet they'd fought as asked to, respectively died and lived for village, as was asked of them, and there had been pride in life taken and life forsaken, and acceptance of all that fate weighed them down with. There wasn't this detachment, this indifference. And as she thought about it, she came fully awake and found herself outraged on behalf of her dead friend, indeed, on behalf of everyone that had foregone something precious to them, who had their choice taken away from them, but embraced their lot and pushed on mute. And it was this pressure which made her voice her thoughts. You said yesterday that the lives of those who died at that exam had no meaning. Naruto looked up from the food he was gorging on, strands of ramen sticking to the edges of his lips. Yeah, I did. What of it? If I recall correctly, then you called them mindless. If by mindless, you mean they gave up a large part of who they were so that someone else may prosper, then that's what they were, yes. But only in that event. You referenced the little joys in life, Naruto. Your bird song and your snowfall add more to that list, if you will. She thought of a brother whom she once venerated. How he had behaved at a happier time, how for a while been loyal, truly loyal, both to country and family, how soft, how just, how full of compassion, and how over time he lost all that, became distant and secretive, adopted a sternness in visage and a stoniness of word and deed, how his embraces brought only tumult, not comfort. How the grooves under his eyes were as graves freshly dug, and a part of her wondered if his monstrous act had sprung from a similar pressure, a similarly contemptible self-pity, a similar sinister faith in a false ideal. She wondered, as she'd wondered before, if her clan's tragedy was secreted from a once brilliant mind drowned in its own murk, not merely insane, but overwrought. Yes, she said. Go ahead and multiply those tenfold. The little joys you describe do not nearly encompass everything foregone. The first little steps taken by your sister. Her first words. Her pouts, her pinings, the things she would otherwise confide in you, all taken away because you were never home. You, after all, are a stranger she sees once a year. Postings to far-off frontiers. The joys sacrificed. Love foregone. Childbirth missed. Your grief for the comrades you were friends with who fell before you. And an ever-readiness to share their fate. The uncertainty with which you step out of your village, you know each mission could be your last. You carry life and death in the pockets of your vest and know that if one day you are slower on the draw or just half a step off your very best, then that is it for you. You know and pretend not to know that on occasion, even your best may not suffice. You are right, the entirety of our existence does indeed boil down to that pressure. And in suggesting that those at the exam who lay there dying did not understand these basic facts, you do them great disservice. Satsuki closed her eyes and saw herself in the faces of these forgotten strangers. Not just herself, but all the life she had taken. Everyone lost to time, and similarly obscured by the stroke of someone else's knife, flashed across the underside of her shut eyelids in a scarlet sequence of unmarked graves, indeterminate in number. All those who still lived but were poised under a similar scaffold seemed to tremble at the fringes of her eyelashes. And she felt a rush of sympathy for her countrymen, who were her kin. They, like these dead genin, lived in uncertainty and struggled day after day under a familiar pressure. Theirs, she continued, opening her eyes, was a higher calling. They put themselves through the everyday grind you described, because if not them, then whom? Someone has to serve. Someone has to forego everything they have and everything they are, so that others may partake in the pleasures you described. Fruits and flowers have their beauty, a grand tree has its majesty, but someone has to be the soil. Someone has to be dirt. That's what we are. Dirt. A country without Shinobi as the soil from which it blooms is a country doomed, one enslaved. And a country enslaved is a country stripped not just of itself, but of all pleasure, drowned in dolor. Its people live and die without meaning. Their sufferance is for their oppressors, they answer to their oppressors, and all their life is on a leash, to be snuffed out as someone else wills, at someone else's whims or megrims. Then all beauty is drowned out by a sea of misery. No one looks at the sun, but to curse it for how it beats down on those already bent. No one notes anything but its cruel fury against a people who lug about loads for their conquerors, captive not just in body, but in spirit. No one feels snowfall, but through rags, and then only its chill, which is no worse than the chill of knowing that the people around you, who live in misery and die unburied, are dying due to your cowardice. You, after all, could not serve or sacrifice when necessary. No, those genin were not mindless. They understood better than you possibly could that they were responsible for the happiness of their people. They understood that some jobs, though inconvenient, need doing. They understood that they were the only ones who could do it. That on their shoulders rested the weight of the world, or at least of every joy that ought to be preserved. They themselves forgo certain joys and pleasures to invite death day on day, that for them was just a small price to pay for family. And that's what the village and the nation is to a shinobi. Their family. The only place they can call home. It is at the center of all action, its preservation is worth all suffering, it will outlast us all. Even when we are gone, we will live through it in the hearts of the people left behind, in their thanks. It is not for the ideal that we live or die, but the people. And I believe that in their last moments, those shinobi, even if terrified, were comforted by the worthiness of the enterprise they died for. Naruto was looking at her with mirth in his eyes. His lips curved into a smile. And these creatures of myth who come to enslave and oppress, are they not shinobi themselves? He asked. And doesn't protecting joy for you just mean taking away someone else's? What of those you orphan, huh? What of the civilian villages you raise? What of the crops you ruin? You stanch the fields with blood. You sabotage, pillage and turn the world upside down to preserve this freedom of yours. Freedom for your kind is enslaving the world. Your people's joy is bought with everyone else's blood. You and I can sit here and go back and forth all day, Satsuki said testily, but the world is what it is. Words do not change it, as they do not change the terms of your service. Kill or be killed, protect or perish. If you have an issue with the dog-eat-dog world we live in, then change it. Change it, or glue your lips together and get in line. But to denigrate those who place above all else the preservation of what to them is their world that is unbecoming of you. What's unbecoming, he said, shaking his head, casually drawing figure eights with his chopsticks, is that a vaguely drawn boundaries your difference between family and enemy. Worlds this side of a border, he drew an imaginary line, are worth saving, while those on the other side you'll happily end. It's my problem with you all, always has been. But either way, all I've said is that I want no part in it. Do as you must. Suffer as you must. But leave me out of it. She peered at him. Both you and I know that that cannot be done. Not with who you are, or what you hold. You must fight, because reality demands it. You cannot run, because reality denies it. Is this rejection of reality your coping mechanism? Oh, no. He laughed. I bow to reality. I let it force me into service. I'll just not allow it into my heart. It won't govern what I do with the little time I have to spare. Pursue greatness, she urged, and you will have more than a little time. Greatness is the difference between life and death, not small things, not a freedom of spirit. Forget service, if you must, forget your father, if you can. Be your own destiny maker. Forge it out of strength, not weakness. Be to yourself your own North Star. Guide your beset vessel through the tempest. You have the talent to live, so why welcome death? This world is not run by dreamers. Dreamers, if not all conquering, are the first to fall. The only freedom they find is in the shallow grave where they are trenched. And with all the things I've said, what makes you think I'm afraid of that? You're afraid, she said levelly, of a life wasted. A life thrown away is one wasted. You said you wished to be Uzumaki Naruto. If so, then fight to preserve everything that makes Uzumaki Naruto who he is. Freedom is not a private pleasure garden in the recesses of the mind, it is a real thing that strength sustains. Your inaction flies in the face of your freedom, and indifferent acceptance of fate flies in the face of liberty. So do not cower. Do not cravenly run from destiny. Face it head on, and bring it to heel. If not, then be crushed against its grindstone. I have said all that I can on this matter. He grinned. If the choice is between my happiness and taking away everything from everyone else, doing to them what was done to me, enslaving them as I was enslaved, then I choose the grindstone. I'm fucked up in many ways. But I'll never have to carry the guilt of somebody else's ruined dreams. Because if I do that, then I'm no different from the father who sacrificed what wasn't his to give. If you say so. She went back to her bowl. This was going nowhere. Talking to her student was like talking to a brick wall. She'd have to find a way to prove her point to him. If not through words, then through a demonstration. And as they sat there, eating, the first semblances of a plan suggested themselves. She resisted the urge to smile. Yes, that would do. That would do very nicely, indeed. Uchiha Satsuki was a slave driver. That's what he'd say if he were being charitable about her. If he were to be a little less so, then she wasn't just a slave driver, but a fucking psychopath. His tracksuit was singed. A smattering of pores, like stomata on a leaf, had perforated the fabric, lending it a dozen micro-mouths. These, over time, and with subsequent exchanges, grew in size, each in itself was now an abyss, so that the remnants of his track top resembled a patchwork of loincloths sewn together. His hair was askew. His breath came out in great gasps. Protuberances the size of pebbles raked from a stream's bottom welted his skin. These, violet in hue, were as plums rotted and expelled pus, or rivulets of red. Friction from skittering across stone and thorn had wrecked his sandals, blistered his soles, bled his toes. He'd kicked off again without complaints, for complaints, he knew from experience, went unheard and only increased the intensity of subsequent exchanges. Besides, it would be most unbecoming to beg. As a result, however, he stood on torn flesh, each squelched step left a red crescent and was accompanied by an audible wince. Yet Uchiha Satsuki, who did not have a strand of hair out of place and had not yet broken into a sweat, paid it no heed. The wind bullets he spat at her bought him a second's respite. But now she returned to pressing him, delivering not blows but feather-light touches, each like a crumb of grace offered, each with the finesse and dexterity of a piano player's tapping. His bones were as keys being tinkled. And there was an artistry in all this, one somehow free from the haphazard clatters and clangs and cleaves of barbarism. Each touch was not the flick of paint onto a slapdash collage swift-strung, but the heaven-inspired daub of an expert's brush on canvas. Contact sounded like the twangs of a bowstring tightly wound. If it weren't for the fact that he was half dead, he'd mayhaps appreciate it more. Fighting Uchiha Satsuki was like fighting a Hyuga, except worse, because none of them, he was sure, possessed her speed. His lungs burned, and so did his limbs. Her fingers were coated with chakra. She blurred in and out of his guard. Their back and forth was a dance that in its thrusts and twists and twirls and pivots and pirouettes, left him with no time to think or breathe, only react. His nose was tickled by the scent of smoldered craters and sand set afire. His arms tingled and swelled under the tuning fork of those four-fingered thrusts, each of which felt like being struck with a bag of cement. All purpose in life was reduced to reading the undulations of her shoulders and reacting to the slightest shifts in weight, the slightest tensions of her body. He predicted and parried, exploited overextensions, rolled with the blows, exploded into motion, and tried recognizing which hits to take, which to block, which to avoid altogether. Not that it helped much. She was relentless. But her relentlessness had a method to it. If she spotted a gap in his defenses, she chipped away at it until he learned how to adjust. Then she'd focus elsewhere, on another chink, and thus remedy another potential weakness. She didn't talk much. But over the past month she'd drummed into him a decent spatial and temporal awareness, and what she called a semi-adequate sense of position and anticipation. Each hit, which once felt like a seismic rupture and often slipped through his guard, was now repelled with more tenacity, or endured more resolutely, and left behind only this tracery of bruises. He'd once lasted 30 seconds, it now took her over 30 minutes to put him away. Oh, she was holding back a lot, sure, but every day she left him with the sense of something accomplished. Left him in agony, too. The nights were horrible. His body dissolved under the strain of 1,000 adrenal delayed pains condensing. And then he had to go back the next day and do it again. And again. And again. He grit his teeth and pirouetted away from a stroke aimed at his head, then spun in the same motion and aimed a kick at a ribsage. This she parried and kept up her pressure, though the edges of her eyes crinkled in approval. She went for the head again. He pirouetted again, but this time his palm exploded into a blue swirl, still incomplete but, thanks to her, infinitely more potent and intricately wound than it had been a month ago. He brought it up in a barreling motion and went straight for the face, only to notice, at the last instant, that she had dropped her guard and was doing nothing bar standing there with her jaw up and her arms by her side. His Rasengan froze a centimeter from her forehead. The blue receded. She huffed in disappointment and pushed his arm away. "Why didn't you take it?" "Thought was a trap," Naruto said. But even as he said it he knew it wasn't true. Her face draped itself in the vestments of a fond irritation. "I hate it when you lie to me." She clucked her tongue. "This isn't the first time either. Not even the first time this fight. You had so many openings, yet you took none for the fear of hurting me." Naruto bowed his head. Her eyes softened. "I've told you before. If this hesitancy carries over to the battlefield, it will get you killed." She reached out and patted his cheek. "And after all the time I've put into you, I would hate that." "I can't help it." He burst out. "It isn't because it's you or something. He sighed. "It's a reflex at this point." She cocked her head and looked at him quizzically. "Because you don't want to hurt anyone? You say it as though the very idea appalls you." "On the contrary," she said, "I understand it fully. How could I not, after the conversations we've had? Besides, I was once the same." She brought up two fingers and shifted the collar of her hakama so that he caught a glimpse of skin and, running from the rim of her neck to her clavicle, the jagged outline of a scar. She let go and pulled the top back in place. "How? Very few shinobi are born callous." She shrugged. "I, too, was once misled and naive, and I almost paid for it with my life. I'd be a terrible teacher if I let you repeat my mistakes." "I'm not misled and naive," he protested. "And not being a savage isn't a mistake." Satsuki smirked. "It isn't," she cooed, her voice lightening, taking on a sing-song lilt, "but forbearing from savagery is only an option for the strong, and you, dear student, are far from strong." She reached out and patted his cheek again. Naruto's eyebrow twitched. "And you, dear teacher, are far from humane," he grumbled. But there was no heat in the remark. And considering how her smirk widened, she knew it too. She was weird. He'd been so certain when she was assigned to him that he wouldn't like her, but then their conversations had happened, and while it solidified his impression of Uchiha Satsuki as a consummate shinobi, willing to kill or be killed for the cause, he'd caught glimpses, too, of something else. Something underneath the formal veneer that suggested the existence of a self beyond the one enameled in somber professionalism and glossed over with a fresh coat of bluster and fanaticism. He'd noticed shades of an actual person. This was someone his age, who enjoyed a back and forth with him and often provoked it without cause, someone sharp-tongued and quick-witted and passionate and often humane, though prickly, someone who, after that first day, never insisted on being called sensei and instead of demanding respect, earned it through action this via the severity of her regimen, which inspired in him a reluctant though primal joy. Through her session she'd discovered for him an inconvenient truth, one that he still shunned when conscious and avoided confronting, but one that misted over his mind at night and cracked its crystal plane, emerging in sleep, slipping through the sieve of his dreams, sedimenting his wakening thoughts with a shame so visceral that days and days were now spent in a pent-up self-denial. A rejection of the self. What she had helped him discover, though herself unaware, was this. The blood of the warrior which sang in his veins was addicted to training and to pain. The intensity of their sessions divested him of his shroud of jocularity, stripped away the self-selected cloak of buffoonery, and for once, instead of drifting or deflecting erratically from life itself like a compass needle, brought too close to the unlike pole of a magnet, he could take a myopic view. Focus on her, as on a singular dot at the center of a wall. And have her be the vessel into which he poured forth the froth of his frustrations. He could cleave and cleave and cleave again and pretend that it was destiny itself. He fought that the exhaustion in his arms was from an exalted mutiny to save humanity and not from a routine spar. His frame in these moments was torrential with a vigor unconstrained. His blood was a brimstone sea, thundering in his ears, sundering all infirmity, sweeping away into the bottomless deep of eternity, the dissolving debris of all that revolted him. Vested in him was the firebrand will of each person who had traversed a stream of time and opposed the Shinobi nation's institutionalized cult of death and thus perished. And he loved it. Loved it despite denying himself the sensation for 2 years. Loved it with some joy and a lot of shame. Shame, because it struck at the heart of everything he held dear, violated every tenet he maintained. Not that he'd ever tell her that, of course. Sit, Satsuki said, and that brought him out of his thoughts. She was eyeing his feet. He limped to a rock that the violence of their routine had not split in half, then sat. She knelt before him and conjured up at the tip of her fingers a balmy green. Her other hand procured a towel, which she wet with a suitin spurt. Then she held up his right foot. Assessed the damage done. All Naruto could see was a red ruin. She nodded in approval. I know Jonin who would have stopped for less. She applied the towel, ignoring the stream of profanity that poured forth from his lips, and watched dispassionately as the towel lost its whiteness and took on the tone and tint of blood. Not like you'd let me, he rasped, his eyes shut. Dear Lord, it hurts so fucking much. She hummed. Maybe, maybe not. But this, she prodded his foot, this is never a bad thing. There's much to be admired in your tenacity. It is a precursor to greatness. She pulled away the rag and pressed her palm to his foot. The pain eased. He opened his eyes and watched skin reknit. Or to brain damage in combat, he said dryly. All it shows is I can take a beating. She smirked. Many, many beatings, I think. You're my favorite chew toy, after all. Naruto shrugged. And I'd just started to see myself as a real shinobi, too. She applied the bloodied rag to his other foot, the smirk fading away and the humor leaving her eyes. Something he couldn't quite place gleamed instead. We'll get there someday, she murmured. The evening found him in an odd mood. Yes, his body bloomed with its daily portion of aches, skin and soft tissue was a quilt lacerated, sutured back together by the power of will alone, but this was routine. What wasn't was how his mind partitioned at the moment into 3 parts frustration, 1 part melancholy churned. He'd been happy when he returned. Afternoon was spent in a daily flipping of pots and pans, a daily scrubbing, a daily assemblage of ingredients, a daily measuring and chopping and stirring, in other words, in a daily preparation of an intricately flavored lunch. It was one of the small joys still left to him. The taste of food hard won after a day's toil was heavenly. Pleasure eddied outward with every bite. Then he'd settle down for an afternoon nap. Only, it never came. Naruto twisted and turned. The activity inspired a discontent that dug through the soil of his mind and raked up, like wriggling worms, half-forgotten memories, half-formed wraiths of thought best left buried due to their impracticality and their self-immolating nature. But once brought up, they wouldn't go. And so he thrashed about, and so gnashed his teeth, and so, in trying not to think, deeper and deeper, entrenched himself in a waist-deep bog of wishful thinking, till every remnant of joy from his productive morning bled into it and was sullied. And then there was the voice. He had a sense of déjà vu the second before it hit. A sinking sensation. A sudden blankness. A rigidity. And then a shuddering, as though in the thrall of an epileptic fit. Then malignant laughter, so suffocating, so corrosive, so like wildfire, that it cindered in a second both head and heart, crumpled him, crushed him, bent him backwards, folded him over. A strangled sob burst from his lips. I have seen your heart. I know of the darkness that dwells there. Each syllable was a scalpel. His eyes watered. The air around him was a malevolent mist. Give me my freedom, and I will give you yours. The room spun and spun, smoked and dissolved. He was a mere morsel being assimilated into the palpitating stomach of a great beast, crunched with each contraction, swathed in digestive fluids, crumbling into acid-eaten fragments. I will leave all that we loathe a charred slag heap. The world, thus cleansed, will be my gift to you, yours to rule, mine to terrorize. For you and I are the same. Shut up, Naruto whispered. Shut up, shut up, shut up. The laughter diminished in pitch and was drawn out into a mocking note. Then it receded altogether. The oppressive aura thawed. It left behind its proof only in the sweat he was drenched in. He stayed motionless an entire minute. Stared at the ceiling. We're not the same, he mumbled to the empty room. We're not. All at once he stood and set out for an evening jog. Shafts from a dying sun dappled the road like rose petals strewn. A breeze licked at his exposed nape and for an instant became the balm of fingertips pressing down in a massage. He was headed nowhere in particular. It was his mind that he was running from. So it was with some relief that he accepted the distraction of storefronts, each in itself an iridescent province, governed by the iron fist of miserly shopkeepers and populated with cabbages and cauliflowers, brinjals and bitter gourds, with boutiques and bouquets. With ornate carvings and earthen urns and Tupperware, with row on row of weapons. Customers approached like a diplomatic delegation and haggled with the hard-headedness of a hostage rescue team. The ludicrousness of this thought brought some respite, and to further forget his shitty afternoon, it was with gusto and in glottal rhythms that he recited aloud the silver lettering atop stores. People turned. People stared. Naruto did not care. He whistled. Threw his arms about in exaggerated motions. Felt the first churnings of a lightening, a brightening, a conscious forgetting. And his spirits were lifted. He rounded a corner. The stores were left behind and the street ahead was vacant. There was a bench some way off, removed from the road, adjoining a park, cocooned in the embrace of verdure and shaded by the approaching dusk. Its osier edges were painted over and glinted with a gunmetal tint. This place, he knew, was on some nights a lover's paradise, a rendezvous point for those seeking to celebrate their illicit passions under night's cover. Here he had, in the past, SB teenage girls and boys furtively pawing at each other and attempting to peck each other's faces off. And it warmed the cockles of his heart to startle them with a whooping war cry, then take off as they sputtered and panted and cussed. Ah, the little joys in life. With similar mischief in mind, he approached. Only, this time the sole occupant was a slender girl in a turquoise tank top. Her nose was buried in a sketchbook. Paint faintly flecked her cheeks. Her hair was unbound, and the wind whipped it about like ripened sheaves of grain. A brush artlessly rested behind one ear. Another loosely dangled between her fingers. All at once she looked up, unseeing, and chewed the inside of her cheek, her countenance distending in distress. Naruto blinked. Rubbed his eyes. Blinked again. Uchiha Satsuki was near unrecognizable without her bun and her hakama and the stoic frown of cold command that he chalked up as lineal, some unfortunate side effect of inbreeding, no doubt. Frankly, she looked nothing like a shinobi and could easily be mistaken for the pretty but uppity daughter of a civilian trader. He inched closer and examined her. When seen like this, there was a naivety to her, a beauty which went beyond her visage and beyond the body that she'd liberated from the stuffy formality of what she usually wore. No, her beauty was in the way she chewed at her lip and squinted and sighed and shook her head, in the way she brought up a free hand and played with an errant lock, twining, twirling, smoothing, then letting go. She seemed enclosed in a field of attraction of which she herself was unaware, made all the more magnetic in ignorance. Her half-lidded eyes seemed at once to take in everything and nothing, somnolently scooping from either memory or an imagined reality figurines for her art. And with each brushstroke it was not just her canvas she filled in, but she herself her greatest masterpiece. As she painted, her etiolated skin gathered a rosy hue. The angular edges of her face attained, as he watched, a refinement powdered by the first dabs of moonlight. A vortex of emotion that whirled therein humanized it and superimposed on the initial impression of supernal perfection, grafted in his mind's eye gradations of earth in texture, earth in contour. This was beauty personified. And for the first time, Naruto was viscerally aware of the fact he was looking at a girl his age, or thereabouts, and not a sexless marbled monument of competence and professionalism and snark. He firmly shut the lid on where his thoughts threatened to take him. Satsuki had gone back to her sketchbook. The world around was quite obviously dead to her, a monochromatic blur. So he did the decent thing. He snuck up to her and somberly announced. "Boo." To her credit, bar a slight tensing of shoulders, she did not react. "Bit late for a jaunt, isn't it?" she asked, not lifting her eyes from her book. He plopped down next to her and stretched his limbs. Yawned. Caught the aroma of perfume. "Huh. That was new too." "Right back at ya," he said. "I'm a jonin." This she whipped out with a crisp note of finality, as though it were the answer to all questions, all the world's problems. "And I'm now Shinobi Core. You also see to it that I've no day life. So nightlife it's gotta be." She rolled her eyes and did not respond. Simply went back to her sketchbook. They were both silent for a minute. Naruto ruptured it. "Taken a liking to fashion, sensei." She glanced at him from the corner of her eyes. "Not everyone can subsist on one tracksuit. That thing stinks. How old is it anyway?" She extended her finger and picked at a singed hole the size of a wart to emphasize her point. "Hey." He pretended to be incensed. "I got a wardrobe full of them." He puffed out his chest and leaned in conspiratorially. "It's a 2-in-1 sorta deal. Uniform and casual wear. HN. So, Naruto said, after another minute's silence, another minute of her pointedly ignoring him and pretending to paint, waiting for your boyfriend. That got a reaction. Her brush stopped mid-stroke. She shut her sketchbook and glared. My, what? The way she said it, one could be forgiven for assuming that he had in one breath spewed the vilest of obscenities at her. Insulted her parents, her clan and her entire village. Naruto had a sudden sense of impending doom. You know this is a lover's meeting point, right? He amended hastily, waving both hands crosswise, as though to ward off evil spirits. She kept staring at him. He wondered if he'd grown a second head. No, she conceded eventually. I just come here every once in a while to paint. Ah. Another 30 seconds of silence followed. So, no boyfriend, then. Satsuki let out a long-suffering sigh. What's it to you? Then, after a second's hesitance, she steepled her palms and placed them on her scrapbook. This might shock you, Uzumaki Naruto, she said, but you and I have the same number of friends. Which is to say, none. As for relationships, the line of work we are in isn't very conducive to them. I can pick a, she pinched the bridge of her nose, as you so crudely put it, boyfriend, and settle down. Or I can serve. But not both. Not at the same time. She gave him a pointed look. That's which of the two I value more. That he began, emitting a horrified gasp and clutching at his heart. That is such a traditionalist take. My traditions are my pride. The way of my people is my pride. Dear Lord, you always this serious? There was another silence. Something she said troubled him. What do I mean, no friends? He asked. You've done missions with half the village. They're colleagues. She looked at the sky, where the first stars were making their presence known. I'm too young to be friends with those my rank. There's a generation between us, and they live different lives altogether. And those my age are my subordinates. They are, how do I put this? Ah, yes, intimidated. You cannot be friends with someone you fear, after all, or envy. No. No, it is for the best. They know they cannot keep up, they know they will always be left trailing in my wake. For once, she sounded melancholy. You've a really high opinion of yourself, you know, he offered sympathetically, then exploded in laughter when she punched his arm. Still, Naruto said, rubbing his arm, I guess we got some similarities, eh? What a formidable pair of shinobi we'll make. The friendless and the lovelorn. The cynic and the automaton. The nut job and the anti-nationalist. Look on our works, ye mighty, and despair. Uchiha Satsuki did not seem amused. It is nice of you to remind me. She lapsed into a more formal speech. I think you have made a lot of progress and are now well prepared. So I want you to go home tonight and pack your bags. Because tomorrow, we will leave the village on a C rank. The C rank? He felt his mouth go dry, his heartbeat quicken. He'd wished this day wouldn't come. But now that it had, he couldn't wait to see the world outside. Yes, a C rank. I took the liberty of collecting our mission this afternoon. She offered him a smile. Our client is one of the biggest businessmen in the elemental nations. One of the provinces under his control is threatening rebellion. Our instructions are simple. To stay there while and to ensure there are no eruptions. Aight. So where we headed? Satsuki leaned forward. Her eyes glittered. Moonbeam modeled her face. You might have heard of the client. His name is Gado, of Gado Enterprises. We are headed to Wave, where a set of fishermen and peasants and other rabble are organizing under a former shinobi named Kaiza. Our instructions are to stave off this mutiny. And if that fails, then we are to quash it by any means necessary. There are times for bluntness and times for an affected obsequity. There are times for plainness and times for platitude. Sometimes an uncanny naivety of intention and action salves the suspicious heart, relieves it from self-imposed confinement, and sets it through propinquity upon the steps of paradise or the steps of delight. At other times, the flies of flattery alight upon decadent heartstrings, or on a countenance immured in luxury, and with such frenzy slaver and rub their limbs against that soft center of manured impressionability, that the result is nearly the same. The foothills of contentment are through the telescope of self-delusion for a moment glimpsed. Gado of Gado Enterprises, she knew, was best satisfied through the latter. In taking this mission she had forsaken personal comfort. The man repulsed her, as did the token simpering and sucking up she was expected to do. But it was all with the germ of an idea in mind, all for the sake of Naruto and the village, for how else? Satsuki sighed, shook her head, and stamped the ground. Naruto was 10 minutes late. She had run into Gado before, of course. There was something about him that made her skin crawl, even back in the day, when she was innocent in some ways, and had not yet digested the notion that at the penumbra of human free will lies a sulfurous cynicism, one that, if allowed to operate unchecked, would not just spread inward and consume the husk of the person who possessed it, but would, like a forest fire, fan outward and cinder all she held dear. So now when she encountered it, she stayed clear of that cynicism or shattered the person possessing it. But staying clear was not an option here. And Gado was beyond shattering, was in himself a shrine of evil before which half the world prostrated itself. And cynicism was all he inspired. She closed her eyes and pinched the bridge of her nose. Back in the day, in her naivety and eagerness to prove herself, she had let herself be drawn into a cosmos of evil, which was neither star-spangled nor constellated. But it was sprawling nonetheless, populated with planets of apathy and tracks of indifference, satellites of corruption and comets of depravity, all governed by the gravitational fields of greed. She'd seen a kind of evil that existed in the mundane. Evil in cufflinks and pinstripes, evil dissected and analyzed, defined and codified, tethered to a wheel of black-lettered legalese, evil abounding in fusty ledgers, and called on with a rustle of pages by jaded accountants, announced numerically, lackadaisically spawned with a jangle, intruding upon reality and currency conceived. Multiplying with a multiplicity of coin, spreading outward, a cancer grown. She had caught a world in the process of its creation, one defined and refined by a sceptered hand that scrimmaged and stymied and savaged not for sport but profit. Gado harnessed cruelty and whipped it forth at will, he added to it a veil of impersonality, an impenetrable air of detachment. He killed without hate. Bloodlessly. For business. And while this in itself was not uncommon, what separated him from the rest was the sense of psychopathy which like a prowling tiger, paced behind the smoke and mirrors of his vices. Look beyond the braggadocio, the clownish suit, the balding pate, the affected accent, the swinishness when he swilled drink, the lechery, and there was nothing but the void. This was a man not just lacking in finer sentiment, but in sentiment itself, a man unfeeling, who through every gesture and every clipped word, communicated a wrongness, an emptiness, a man secure not in a sense of self, but a lack of it. His rage, like his pity, was non-existent. Perhaps in the futile hope of feeling something. He glutted himself upon the world and its carnival of sorrows. Carved up domains, cannibalized countries, killed with impunity. His empire was constructed atop a crematorium. Corpses, like children's toys defunct, desolated the attic of his past. And he did all this, Satsuki thought, for the tepid flicker of contentment offered by a fraction of an uptick in a bank account already limitless. Money to him was a motley substitute for sentiment. And when that flicker faded, he once more set in motion the apparatus that brought about someone else's ruin. Ruin. The word for a second spun out of her control the steering wheel of her mind. Images of ruin like termites descended on the decrepit wattled hutments wherein she tenanted a destitute conscience, and for the merest of moments, she recalled with startling clarity a merchant in Iowa who in despair thrust forth a fistful of money. An urchin in Kusa who sightless stood outside the slag heap of what was once his village, a sentinel in Taki whom she had staked to a wooden post, and an eternal silence that in the cold cocoon of her dreams distended into the tinkle of coins, the laughter of hyenas. Satsuki shut her eyes, but there reverberated through her mind the sobs of a mother, the screams of a child, and through this all the rise and fall of a knife in synchronicity with each plea, a rise and fall that in its rhythms resembled an infant heart yet to be rent. "Sorry I'm late." She opened her eyes, looked at him and smirked. The termites were shaken off. Her mind was hers once more. "What took you so long?" Naruto rubbed his head, as he often did when embarrassed. "Was out of soap," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "So had to go and get myself one. But halfway through there was this blind old lady who needed help crossing a street, and she made such a racket when I said I was running late that I had to say, 'Shinobi oh the leaf, madam.' That scared her into submission. I left her there. I hope she fell into a ditch and died. But anyway, I carried on. And then a black cat crossed my path, and since I am very superstitious I of course took the long route to the shop and—" "You overslept, didn't you?" she asked flatly. He hung his head and rubbed it again. Satsuki had a sudden urge to reach out and poke his forehead. But the thought of that gesture brought back memories unbidden, ones best left unexplored. So she refrained. They made their way to the gate, where Kotetsu recognized her and raised his hand in greeting. They'd worked together before. He was the first chunin she served with after herself becoming one, and 3 years later when she'd taken over as an Anbu captain, his was the first face that greeted her. He'd worked under her for a year before quitting due to a clash in morals and ideals. The other chunin she knew, but had never spoken to. One Izumo Kamizuki. "You heard the news from Kumo, chief?" Kotetsu asked. Satsuki offered him a nod. "Fuck, man," he laughed, "I hope those shitheads got wiped. There's a rumor that the Rikage received a fatal blow and is at death's door." "I heard he's dead, and thank the Lord if it's true," said Izumo. "It is not," Satsuki informed them. "I spoke to Genma, who as Kotetsu here knows has a contact there. He says the Rikage is shaken but alright. The brother is in bad shape, but alive. There was considerable damage to property, and some death too, perhaps, but it is not as bad as what we had here, back in the day." "Aw, man. That's a damn shame," Kotetsu said, and the bandages on his face crinkled in agreement. "Where you headed, by the way?" "Wave," she said. 2-month job, perhaps. Aw, that sucks. Place is a piss pot right now. Kur and I went that way some time ago, and on my mother you'd think she saw some shit. Asuma, you know Asuma, chief. Ha, course you do. Yeah, he and I had a drink the other day, and he says he's dating her, Kur and I, but listen to this, he says place is a ghost town. Kids starving on the streets and all. He shook his head and leant forward with interest. We with M or against M? I am not at liberty to say. Against M, then. He laughed. Damn, chief, you're still easy to bait. He turned towards his register, which lay open on a rickety table. I'll put you down for 2 months. Send in a search party if you don't return in 3. Satsuki rolled her eyes. Aw, there's that eye roll again, Katetsu complained. Izu, I've been babysitting this girl ever since she was in her diapers, man, and this is how she repays me. A guy's got no respect no more. They judge me on my jacket, man. A tragedy for the ages, I am sure, Satsuki said dryly. And if it bothers you so, then upgrade that jacket, you incorrigible lout. Heaven knows you are wasted here. Wasted? Why, I never. Wasted, she says, Izu. Why, this damn place, he tapped the table with his fist, this place is as cushy as it gets. Just sit here and watch the people come and go. Talk to 'em about the weather and banter with 'em. I got a private line to the latest gossip from all over the world. We hear it before the Hokage does. He grinned. Come now, chief. Admit it. You loved your week here as a security guard. You sat right there and painted all day. And often he turned to Naruto, who, much to Satsuki's horror, was listening with interest. Often she'd make him sad eyes and just imagine being a painter forever. You'd hear it in her sighs. We all got a life unlived, lad, and the 1 week she spent here was hers. Now she spends her days bitterly jealous of free folk like me. Don't let your dreams be dreams, unlike Chief over there. You can smell the insomnia on her if you lean in and take a good long whiff. Katetsu, what the fuck? No, seriously. What the fuck? This had never happened. She'd been bored to tears, and if not for her drawings she'd have harakiried herself before the week was out. I want to man that outpost someday, Naruto said wistfully, an hour after they'd left it behind. He'd been very silent until then. But his face was now the very image of longing and misery. Shut up, Naruto. She could feel a headache coming on. She needed strong coffee. It was too early in the day for this. Your seal's a masterpiece, she said, crossing her hands across her chest and resting her hip against a tree trunk that was next to their campfire. He was stuffing himself, but now he paused and looked up. Sorry, what? They'd made camp for the night. They'd traveled a good distance and were halfway through the land of fire, though the tract of woods they paused in was in the middle of nowhere and adjoined fens and lakes and marshes and was besprent with snakes and scorpions and other scuttling predators besides. There was no town for 100 miles either way. Satsuki would have preferred an inn and a bath over this insect-infested hellhole, but she'd been here before. One did not acquire a taste for luxuries in this business. Besides, Naruto was dog-tired and flagging by the end, and though he did not complain, she could see in his cumbersome movements a man dead on his feet. So they'd stopped. There was time, anyway. You heard them talk this morning. Yeah, about your dead dreams of being an artist. Not that, idiot. Before that. The land of lightning thing. Kumo. The Hokage. Oh, that. He shrugged. Figured it was none of my business. She sighed. It kind of is, she confessed. The Hokage's brother is a Jinchuriki. He'd been shaking his legs and only half paying attention. Now he went very still and slowly swiveled about till he was facing her. Is he, now? There was a certain tension to his voice, a stiffness in his shoulders. Kumo, like us, has had a difficult history with their Jinchuriki. There have always been incidents, hostilities, breakaways, the skies set afire, ice-girt mountains riven, the snow streaking down in an avalanche and swallowing up the remains of a shattered host, you get the idea. Theirs, in fact, is a history more violent than ours. But they've always been obsessed, in a way we never were, with controlling their Jinchuriki. They've stubbornly held on to the notion that beneath the violence and the imperfections of a tailed beast, there lies a greatness unexplored. And so the Hokage helped seal the Hachibi into his brother. An oppressive silence greeted this declaration. The seal, she went on, was imperfect. It is why I mentioned yours. They gave us a glimpse of yours a while ago in a confidential report, and the thing is a miracle. An impossibility. We haven't been able to fully decode it, but from what we can gather it has a set of inbuilt safeguards to ensure stability and avoid a breakaway. Kumo has never had a seal master quite as era-defining in ingenuity as the Lord Fourth. And the brother suffered for it. It went wrong. He has phases of normality. But he's kept away from public scrutiny. Understandably so, it is quite intolerable to him. He is volatile at the best of times. And there are episodes. The one I mentioned this morning was particularly violent. I've heard he's in a coma. Naruto barked out a laugh. It was harsh to listen to, a set of needles sprayed across the aisle, the sound echoing on for an eternity. Good for him, I guess. When have you lot ever given a shit about familial ties? Conversation cooled after that. She considered arguing the point with him. But there was a distant look in his eyes, the specter of his past had him in its translucent clasp. So she refrained. He needed space, and given that she'd come to find him tolerable, grown quite fond of him and his quirks, in fact, though she'd never say it out loud, it was the least she could do. Midnight drew upon them like a quilt lacquered obsidian. The clouds at daybreak were scudding strips of translucent gauze, behind which there grew like a plum engorged a fractious sun, the color of rust. The humid air and the wind which winched and whirled beckoned the onset of a dust storm. The ground was unverdured, an ocher spiderweb wherein tree stumps like caramel-colored houseflies were caught between earth and cracks. The smell of stubble set ablaze winged the air and was a plumed incense beating against it and turning it pungent. They'd traveled 2 hours, and the nearest town was no longer too far off. They'd have to stop somewhere come afternoon, for if there was one thing that even Jonins loathed while traversing, it was a sandstorm. Satsuki snuck a glance at Naruto through the corner of an eye, then tucked an errant lock behind her ear and pinched her lips together. His glum silence made her yearn for his former brashness. His silence communicated a wrongness, presaged calamity. In the month they'd spent together, she'd learnt that the boy, despite first appearances, and despite his occasional outburst, was sprightly and verbose, cut out for action, not contemplation. His naivety, which came from not knowing himself and not seeing the world, had its own peculiar charm. It was a charm the city dweller saw in the rustic, the scientist in the primitive, one that stemmed from simplicity. And sometimes she envied it, for the horror to reality lay in its realization and internalization. Even those like her who took it on its terms and sought to hew from it for themselves a totem of greatness walked a tightrope beneath which there gaped jagged spires of resentment and cynicism. Hers was a high-stakes waltz of life and death, where to go wrong was to go mad. She'd seen her betters crushed under boulders of guilt. The ignorant, on the other hand, lived in unreality, or at least in an altered state of reality, and so in a way were better off for it. They had no responsibility, they were children, not warriors, they had the understanding and the inclinations of unshod urchins, and took at all times the path of least resistance, whereas it was in friction that greatness lay, though it scorched the soil and left the soles of one's feet mangled. Either way, he wasn't talking, and while personal space and privacy were sacred, this glumness would more likely than not lead to insurrection, and if not to that, then to a descent into depression, or the bottle. In this business one never thought too deeply, never dwelt on things, never allowed one's conscience to get in the way, because that was a rabbit hole from which not many returned. Minute by minute was the motto, minute by minute and day by day, one lived and barely lived and made peace with the present, with the certainty of the moment and the eternal uncertainty of all beyond. One looked outwards and kept looking outwards, because to look too far inward was to run the risk of discovering something unsavory, best kept under lock and key. And one never forgot one's roots or one's family, the first of which he disowned and the second of which he thought had betrayed him. And so she found herself in a situation where she was forced to take initiative and try and enliven the mood, or at the very least get him talking and keep him talking. There was just one issue with this. She was absolutely horrible at making conversation. Oh, she could maintain it, sure, but starting one and keeping it going had always been an issue. It's your first time outside the village, isn't it? She tried. Yeah. 30 seconds of awkward silence followed. So, how do you like it? Sucks. This wasn't going well. Oh? Which parts in particular? She congratulated herself. There was no way he was getting out of this without a longer rest. This just rocks. Rocks and mosquitoes. She wiped a thin film of sweat off her forehead. Nibbled her lip. It isn't, she announced, eventually. Do you not see the kaleidoscope of shadow the sun makes there, right there, when it falls on that tree stump? There's a world waiting to be sketched in that interplay of light and shadow, but only if you look for it. What I mean, she persisted, is that there is a magic in the ordinary, waiting to be captured on paper. Not falsified, but enlarged, so that you can see, truly see, the beauty in things. Rocks are not rocks, but castles of possibility. The rings in trees are as the rotation of worlds, and even in insect-infested dens, there is always something of paradise, something quite extraordinary. This is as with most things in life. Weren't you the one who went on and on about trying to enjoy the little things in life? He shrugged. And aren't you the ones hell-bent on taking life? Man's gotta keep up with the times. I give up. She threw up her hands. You're moping. Stop moping. I don't like it. She didn't realize he was laughing till he brought his hand up to try and pass it off as a coughing fit. Then he gave up and laughed without shame. The nerve of some people. But she felt her lips curve into a reluctant smile. Beauty in little things, huh? I guess we aren't really that different, after all, he said wryly. She thought once more of a misted-over house in the recesses of memory, where a mother begged for her child, of how Katesu had told her not to do it, of how he had wavered and shouted and frothed and raged, and the next day tendered his resignation, and how she through it all had been unmoved, quite unmoved. Of how no one on her team looked at her the same way after that. Of how she alone stood so far above the rest, Konoha's sentinel, its most ardent protector, willing to do as bid and savage the world that she the day before had beautified on canvas. She crushed with her fingers what her heart enshrined. And it was all for love, familial love, the most beautiful kind there was, for they were hers and she was theirs, and that was all there was to it. Her smile grew more beautiful. Naruto's own widened in response. He could not know what turn her thoughts had taken. Silly boy. Silly boy. I guess we are not, she replied. And a shard of guilt for a fleeting second wedged itself in her heart. The water sparkled and rippled and when touched fled concentrically. It was a pellucid sheet, a gossamer sheath, rubble and industrial remnants percolated underneath, and so did shells and shoal and seaweed. The boat's prow bisected it, the oars in a display of rugged violence displaced it, and Naruto watched with some interest as the stream shrugged off the assault and reknit itself, a gash not just healing or sealing shut, but refusing to acknowledge both its own existence and their presence. That's the dream, he thought to himself glumly, closing his eyes. Be like still water. Refuse not just the sediment in you, but the violence enacted upon you. Refuse participation. Refuse action. Suffer. Suffer and be still, and pretend nothing's changed. That was the dream, and it was a pipe dream. He couldn't feign naivety. Not after yesterday. Fate until then had seemed like this far-off thing. Shifting images yet to concretize in a cracked crystal ball, hopes and dreams decaying, but yet to die. It was the inevitable end that would someday be spun into reality from the spiderweb of authority, to be faced alone in an indeterminate future, to be surrendered to, but not without a fight. But fate last night had come looking for him. It was one thing to vaguely know that there existed a world outside, where Jinchuriki like him had it hard, it was quite another to have it confirmed that to be a Jinchuriki was to live a life of instability, where one constantly kissed the precipice of madness. And when Satsuki had spoken about the Rikage's brother, it was not the man Naruto mourned for, but himself. The sporadic temptations of the fox were all one by one recollected, and he wondered if that would ever be him, if someday he would go similarly mad and give to the world that had only ever taken from him the terror that it so justly deserved. There it was again, that damned fear. There it was, that stab of resentment. Do nothing, suffer all, let the world around you unfold, as it must, because to do otherwise would. Drifted off. We've reached. Naruto opened his eyes. Offered her a broad grin. Stepped off the boat. Looked around. And found himself disappointed. Is said it'd be pretty. It is, I think. In a rustic way. Horseshit. Seen nicer public urinals. We're not here on holiday, Naruto. Nah, but you yapped on and on about it. Called it a tourist utopia. Uchiha Satsuki, who'd let her hair down and traded her hakama for the functionality of a jonin vest and typical jonin attire, colored. It was prettier back in the day, when I came this way, she conceded. Naruto shrugged. Looks like shit now. And so it did. A line of scraggy shrubbery of a fungal hue stretched into the distance. The spent sun drooped that way. Closer to them was a wasteland decked in dying stubble, with soil the color of rust, and stacks of rebar strewn about, and oil slicks, and a decrepit dockyard left incomplete. A knot of men ran to and fro and sprinkled the evening air with acrid profanities. And amidst the confusion there marched their way a heavy-set man with a sword at his waist and a tattooed front. He wore an eye patch and looked every bit like a cliched baddie, but when he spoke his voice was soft. Uchiha-san. He bowed when he reached them. Been a long time. Baraji. Satsuki gave him a nod, then turned to Naruto. This is our client's right-hand man. Waraji, this is my student, Uzumaki Naruto. Baraji furrowed his brow. We asked for you, he grumbled. Just you, nobody else. This ain't some picnic or field project. Boss won't pay for a team, I know that much. He wants the best, not some. He stared at Naruto, then looked at Satsuki and swallowed down whatever insult first came to mind. Some wet behind the ears rookie. He grimaced and spat. Oi, big guy. Naruto puffed out his chest and tapped it. Lem tell ya, I ain't the best shinobi ya ever hired, but I got heart. Lots of heart. Can't buy that shit. Hers is made of tin, but mine. PFFT. Pure gold, mister. Satsuki shot him a frigid look that euthanized the rest of his attempt at whimsicality. The payment was already decided on, she said to Waraji, so it should not be an issue. But if my student's presence here is such a hindrance, then he and I can take the next boat back to the land of fire. Now, Uchiha-san. Waraji wiped his nose against his arm and looked around nervously. Didn't mean ta hurt you or nothing. We got a problem here, is all. and you know how the boss is. Take me to him. Ah. Waraji looked around again. He ain't around. Something urgent's come up and he left Zori and me in church. You're supposed to work for us. He avoided her eyes and looked for all the world as though he expected to be driven headfirst through rebar for the audacity of this pronouncement. Satsuki raised an eyebrow. Then we can either proceed with my suggested arrangement, she said pleasantly, or you can explain to your boss why I refused his task. Waraji looked up and gave her a smile which revealed a rotting tooth or five. You must be hungry, the both owe you. Places this way. Their residence was on the outskirts of the land of Wave. It had 2 floors. It was neither opulent nor Spartan, but communicated instead a sense of being nondescript, slate-shaded, stale-odored, speckled with evidence of decay, cracked, covered from top to bottom in a fine film of dust. Neither shabby nor spick and span, but bland, utterly bland. The place held 12 men. Cigarette smoke pooled from the windows, which were left open at all times. The front adjoined a small garden, and the first floor branched out into a terrace the size of 3 cubicles glued together. It was nothing to write home about, but it was better than suffering the everyday atrocities of a tented existence in the middle of nowhere. At night there wafted into the arid air the sound of sniffles and sobs, moans and groans, thuds and creaks and bumps. This went on for 2 or 3 nights, then the routine of these sounds was abruptly perforated by a shrill scream. The scream rose in pitch, went on and on. And it was at this that Uchiha Satsuki, her eyes puffy, her hair askew and undone, her lips drawn into a thin line, wrenched open her bedroom door and marched across to the room from where the screams were being emitted. A sharp rap and 3 or 4 muted statements later she stepped into the room and there fled from it a half-naked woman, perhaps 30, her hair matted, her fingernails dirty, teeth yellowed, robes frayed, frame pallid and shrunken. This done, Satsuki stepped out, turned to the man, who Naruto noted was Waraji himself, and after another softly uttered sentence or two, she marched back into her room and shut the door. He heard the sound of a lock clicking. All this Naruto observed while himself in the throes of an inexplicable insomnia. He refused to entertain thoughts about what this event meant or what the terror in the woman's eyes as she rushed by implied. Her eyes were sunken, so you could clearly see the grooves, her skin was lusterless and her countenance so emaciated that at a glance you could envision her skull. He was struck by the sensation of having seen a skeleton go by, a skeleton that wore its skin in a fleshly shroud. And he had a sudden conviction that it was death which brushed him by, death animated, death festering and fructifying in the maggot-infested womb of some whore, cannibalizing her innards, awaiting the moment when it would burst through her body and claim the world for itself. He was not able to sleep the rest of the night. Morning, with its rubescent shafts, broke in a flurry of red like flecks of flesh scattered. But come night again the sound somehow ceased altogether. What did you tell him? Naruto asked when he next saw Satsuki. But this isn't a brothel. The week went by. It was mid-morning. They were seated in the dining room. And Waraji was already drunk. Zori don't live with me no more, he was saying. He got this place the other side oh this shithole, the mongrel th bumfic lover. Yeah we know. You said this, like, 100 times already. Shut up, man. Waraji ignored him and wildly waved his sheathed sword about. Then he dropped it. Son oh a bitch has all the fun. It dribbled out in a hushed confession, tinted with envy and admiration. He and a few of the boys keep things straight bout here. He's the disciplined guy, he the man. And that said he smacked his lips together and downed another gulp of the noxious liquid he had been swilling all morning. Belched. Broke wind. He's disgusting, Naruto said, staring at the ceiling. He shut the comic he'd been flipping through. Hey, big guy. You're disgusting. Iwu, senpai, Waraji said gravely, emotionally, his lower lip quivering, his eyes watering. You so mean to me. Uchiha Satsuki, who was reading a textbook on medical ninjutsu that even from its cover looked frighteningly technical and utterly dull and full of life-sapping gibberish, looked up. She'd swapped out the stuffiness of her jonin attire for the homeliness of a kimono. The bun was back in place, held together by a set of needles. Ignore him. There was a long-suffering look in her eyes. He's always like this when drunk. Waraji's head landed on the table with a thwack. This was accompanied by snores. What a shit place, I swear, Naruto grumbled. Sit here and do nothing, and stay the fuck away from these dipshits who'll fight ya at the drop of a hat. Boring. Boring. Perseverance is a virtue. I ain't the virtuous sorta guy. Her eyes gleamed. Maybe that's why you need to learn it. Good things come to those who persevere. Did you, swallow a book on cliches as a kid? Cliches are well worn for a reason. She shrugged. You'll find that most hold true. Not this one, though. Meaning, wait long enough and you get old. And the older you get the higher the chance your heart just goes poof. He raised a fist, then opened it languidly and made an upward motion, a mushroom cloud. We've waited, sister. Oh, we've waited and waited. You and I, we're old. It's been a long, long wait. A million billion years of listening to this Shathil and his drunken rants. I have a low bar for you at the best of times. But that was beyond dreadful. You break my heart. Just stomp on it already and call me Uzumaki. Oh, shut up. There it was again, the eye roll, accompanied by the smallest of grins. Blink, and you'd miss it. There was something in it that quickened his heartbeat just a smidgen, and… Naruto cleared his throat. So, he asked, why we waitin'? I mean, I thought it was a swoop in, shake the guy down, break a bone or 10, swoop back out kinda thing. What are we waiting for? She closed her textbook, looked at him, crossed her arms, raised an eyebrow. You tell me. Wow, so you don't know either. No, you idiot. For a moment he thought she'd wring her hands in despair. It's a test. A thought experiment. Tell me why we haven't made a move yet. I dunno. You're lazy and love the company of thugs. Naruto. The no has broken starving so you gotta run up the bill. We do charge hourly, don't we? Naruto. Her expression clearly said. Cut the crap. Decide. Yeah, okay. Fine. He rubbed his nose. Squinted at the ceiling and nibbled at the inside of his cheek. You said there's a bridge being built? He asked after a minute. She inclined her head in acknowledgement. You went and looked at it on the first day. You already seen the main cast of this drama. You know, the guys we gotta put the fear of the Lord into. Yes, that's correct. So why aren't we? No, wait, don't tell me yet. He closed his eyes. Tried concentrating. The underside of his eyelids involuntarily flamed with sheets of light, exploded into a frenzy of sparks. These were torches dispelling the quiescent dark, and once more there emerged from the white heat of his guilt the grainy memory of that woman gliding by. Over and over she drifted past, a video recorder broken, stuck on repeat, her face shadowed over, shifting. Then within the space of a grimace she began to transmute, the skin turning fleecy, flaking, cracking, peeling off, the mane elongating, the form distending, diminishing, becoming quadruped. And within his mind's eye he watched horrified as half a second's metamorphosis unmade and then remade her. She was no longer a woman, but a sheep being led to an abattoir. And the twine around her neck was in his hands, he her captor, his silence sealing her fate. Do nothing, suffer all, let the world around you unfold, as it must. Naruto opened his eyes hurriedly. You're playing for time. His voice sounded shrill, even to him. Unnatural. Or at least the client is. Else this is straightforward business. She looked at him with a half squint. She'd picked up on his discomfort but made no mention of it. He appreciated that. And why would the client play for time? I dunno, he's hoping for a peaceful solution or something. Nothing else makes sense. Close enough. Satsuki offered him a smile. We've been told not to act because he still hopes that he can find a solution which is satisfactory to all parties. He has a delegation hashing out details at the moment. He more or less owns this land. He controls both the industry here and the sea routes. He has a similar stranglehold over several areas across the world. So when rebellion began to brew, when they began building that bridge, he pulled some strings and tripled the tax rates because it occurred to him that he would no longer have a monopoly if the bridge were completed. It is a portal to the outside world and thus to competing interests. He is reluctantly willing to make an example out of this land in the hope that it prevents other insurrections. What a wonderful human being. But, she went on, ignoring his snide aside, Gado harbors some hope of making them see their folly. He is willing to recant the tax rates, which were enforced a year ago. He is willing to let things go back to what they were. For this he needs the leaders of this land to see reason. Some have been persuaded, others purchased, but there is this one fisherman who has anointed himself the leader of the people. Kaiser, if I recall correctly. He retains massive public support. He refuses to bend or to be bought out, and it is he who is at the forefront of this bridge. If he can be persuaded, the rebellion will fall. If not, then he will have to be brought down. But the latter is a last resort. The client would rather retain his business in this province and tide things over than burn it all down. Beggaring them has affected him too, in a way. Or at least a fraction of his profits. Naruto barked out a laugh. I ever tell you that I love the kind of clients we serve? A few times, yes. She did not bat an eyelash or miss a beat. So why me, huh? I beg your pardon. Naruto pointed to himself. Why me? He gestured to the passed out Waraji. That guy said they asked for you. Just you. I don't need babysitting. I fail to see the point of me here. Yukawa left me back home and come fix this mess yourself. It'd be easier. This is just me, I dunno, sitting around and swatting flies. Why, I thought you'd never ask. She smirked at him, and it was in this moment that he knew he was screwed. I need you to explore Wave, she said. Find this fisherman. Persuade him to drop this cause of his. I thought you said there was a delegation doing just that. Yes. She offered an upturned palm and made a graceful half shrug. But they lack what do they call it? Ah, yes, a personal touch. You, on the other hand, you are a victim of our village. You see us for what we are, or so you tell me. So what I want you to do now is to go out there and convince him of how evil a people we are. Sell him on our ruthlessness and make it clear to him that the price of resistance is death. There was something inscrutable in her look, something calculating. Every trace of the girl he had chatted with companionably just moments ago had disappeared and was now replaced with a statuesque poise and frigidity. She made a shooing gesture. Scram, little fox. Go enjoy the world outside. This man's destiny is in your hands. Wave was a cyst ruptured. A town trapped in torpor. A stinking slag heap sprinkled with the debris of a populace. These were the thoughts which came to his mind when he wound his way through the town square, where citizens haggled over a withered harvest and tumbled about in graceless locomotions. Their breath emerged in rancid puffs, their skin was of a sickly pallor, a wheatish hue which had been whitened in places by anemia. Their bellies were bloated and bore a tumid rotundity. On their faces, above scurvy gums, there festered an acceptance of their destitution. Theirs, he saw, was a destiny penned at the hands of a nouveau riche conqueror, and they accepted it with nary a sigh. To thus suffer defilement, to suffer the whips and scorns of fate, to suffer through conditions so fundamentally deplorable that the horrors of existence acquired the lusterless mundanity of the quotidian. This was life, in this lay the essence of existence. Reality resided at the center of this stasis. Reality was a shrubless desert which on occasion was smoothed over by the mirage of mirth. It was an unlocked cage, from which saber-toothed death sprang forth. He saw in their fate his own mirrored and felt for them a torrential sympathy till, inflamed, he too was one amongst their throng. Drowning in an unnavigable mire but suffering in silence and grace. Living like them for himself. In spite of the tyrannies inflicted on them they lived. Though broken, they lived. Though brought to their knees they got back up and went on living. They found in the vast night of sorrow a flicker of happiness to latch onto, which was a candle, a match lit momentarily. And when that went out they found another, then yet another, till the vast void of grief was crushed under the weight of an atom of joy. And that was life, that was all there was to it. A mote of dust was heavier than a kingly crown. Pomp had its day, but not here, and not in his heart. And thus he would be free, forever free. His heart would swell with the strains of a defiant harmony. He would scale the jagged summit of human tyranny, not to bow before its crimson fane, but to bleed upon its spires, each drop an accusation, a validation, a triumph. Glory in the suffering. Glory in giving the universe the middle finger. Satisfaction too. Throw at me whatever the fuck you wish to. Go on, I dare you. Do your absolute worst. You can't break me. I'll take 10 times the punishment, 10 times the injustice, and still stay unmoved. Naruto looked about and grinned bitterly. Kindred spirits here. He'd found kindred spirits here. He wandered about, but the images everywhere were the same. A land savaged. A land consumed. Plundered. Defiled. Eaten up by the locusts of greed. Its people deflated. Dying. The skin sticking to their bones. The afternoon sun leaching away at their life. Sweat in rivulets streaming down their foreheads, washing away the fight in them. And their eyes glazed over in acceptance, their shoulders slouched over in affirmation of a suffering that came to them unsought and would not leave till every man, every woman and every child had shriveled up and submitted to fate itself. Beyond humiliation now. Beyond degradation. Beyond despair. Beyond saving. Sentiment twisted his heart. Tears stung his eyes. Naruto gnashed his teeth and scrubbed his sleeve over his face in a near apoplectic fury. None of that now, he thought. None of that shit. Look. See what we do to people. This is what you work for. This is what you are made to uphold. And once more there was that familiar stab of resentment. He wanted nothing to do with this. He wished he could bring back Namikaze Minato and drive a kunai through the man's heart. Distraction came in the form of a tug at his track top. He turned around and was confronted by a little girl, 7 years old perhaps, who had a bunch of wilted flowers in her hands. She wore rags, but there was something about her that was different from the land itself and from the people that, like reanimated corpses, muddled through its unblazed trails. She was emaciated, yes, and her face had a hollowed-out look, but her eyes were bright. Life leapt and twirled behind those eyelids. She wore a sun-struck smile that was blinding in its innocence. "Spider lilies, sir." She held up her offering. "I got red spider lilies. And carnations too. Just 100 ryo." Naruto grinned. "Nah, kid. Nah, I'm good." Her smile flickered, then faded. Her arms dropped nervelessly to her sides. The light in her eyes, which just a second ago had been a second sun, began to seep away. "Sir, she shifted about and looked away in shame. "Just one bowl of miso soup, Nai-san," she blurted out. Then, seeing his face, she hastily amended, or 1 carat. Anything. Her head dropped. Haven't eaten since last night. My flowers are bad and no one buys 'em. But I promise, just 1 bite and I'll find something better for you by tomorrow. No payment. Just food. Please. The whirlwind of emotion. The murderous rage. A fraction of a second passed, within which he raked up an image of Minato Namikaze and mutilated it 6 different ways. Tears again threatened the edges of his eyes. Then Naruto looked at her and offered her his widest smile. Sure, kid, he took her flowers. These are beautiful. I'ma keep him. I know a girl who like him. Hope shone in her eyes. Really, Nai-san? Yeah. He grinned. Come along. You and me. We're gonna go eat a feast fit for Kami himself. Thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed the story. If you did, please like the video. Also consider subscribing and sharing this with your friends. This will really mean a lot for me. I'll see you in the next one.